Greetings to everyone, my name is Syroyid. I'm professor of music education and doctor of musicology. Also, I'm a composer and pianist. You can check my music on my main YouTube channel, which is Syroyid at YouTube. So what we'll be doing here is looking at one of the greatest pieces of music history, and it's the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. As we'll be looking into this manuscript in this Urtext edition that I have in front of me, we'll be also discussing a little bit the main question that arises, which is the fact that this piece, according to certain musicologists, wasn't even written by Bach, but was attributed to him, and probably it derived from maybe even a violin piece that was later on transcribed, which is quite common. We can see that in other cases of Bach, where he kind of moved from violin to keyboard and did these pieces. So the whole point of this channel is to provide educational materials to my current students. I teach music composition. If you would like to study composition with me, you can put it in the comments or send me an email to myname@gmail.com. My name is Syroyid. And then the channel started really to grow. So I would really appreciate hearing more from who you are, what's your musical background, because in spite of having right now 500 subscribers, I don't really quite know what's your musical background and what are your musical interests. So I would really appreciate hearing more from you. So just spend a couple of lines in the comments and explain basically when did you study music, what's your musical interest, and why are you watching these videos. So without further ado, we'll begin with a short introduction of musical context on this piece. Not much is known, unfortunately, so a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are uncertain and even speculative in nature. And then we'll focus on the main part of this video on the musical analysis. So we'll divide it into first analyzing the toccata, then the famous fugue, and then there is a coda at the end that we can clearly see that happens once the fugue ends. Here we have this recitativo, which kind of hints to the ending and the coda. So I'm going to show you briefly the sources. This is the source I'm going to be analyzing. That's the first manuscript that was discovered, and it's not by Bach, and clearly it's also mixing quite interestingly languages. So you have fuga written like it's not fugue, toccata in Italian. So it's kind of an interesting combination. And then, of course, the signature of the transcriber. And here you can see by the notation, well, that it was condensed. We don't see the pedal written separately, but it's all written in two staffs. And in spite of, well, being a relatively modern notation, still we can see the soprano clef written like this, right? Which kind of in Mozart's time, they already started to switch more to the treble clef. All right, so let's go to the Wikipedia article. It's very extensive, so I'm not going to be reading about it, all of it, but well, what you can see is that it says that according to the oldest sources, and the source that I'm going to what we have is this Johannes Rink's manuscript. By the way, if you want to know who Johannes Ringk was, here we have a little article about him. So apparently, well, he was one of the people who copied Bach's pieces and made these manuscripts, and his most famous contribution is the copy of this Toccata and Fugue, although, again, not too much is known about his life. Right, and returning back to the main article, we can see that the date and the origin of the piece is unknown, so really we don't know quite much about why Bach wrote this piece and for which occasion, but most of the times these organ pieces were played, of course, in the context of a concert or in the mass service. And in this case, well, we can see that it's structured in a very common form. Bach has a lot of these toccatas and fugues where he is introducing the toccata works like a prelude that's presenting the main key, and it's working also as a warm-up to the keyboard. And then the fugue is like the main core element. Now, why so much discussion arises around this toccata and not others? Well, primarily because it's extremely unique, and if we look at all of the other toccatas and written by Bach, they don't share the same writing, the same melodic writing, the same harmonic writing. And the fugue at the same time is also very peculiar and presents quite awkward passages that you wouldn't find usually in a fugue. Just to kind of show it briefly what I mean, once we'll get to the fugue, you can clearly see these interludes where there's not much of a counterpoint, or you can see passages where the subject is presented without any accompaniment, just on the pedals. This is quite unusual. You don't really see that much of this in Bach's other fugues, and he wrote a lot of fugues, so that kind of allows us to contrast. And then the music is extremely popular nowadays, so it draws a lot of attention, and oftentimes when that happens, well, more theories start to arise around the piece. Now, the history of it, or at least what we know, is that in 1833, that's 83 years after the death of Bach, so really, really far away, the first publication of the piece happens based on this manuscript that I was showing you. And this was basically done through Felix Mendelssohn, who was really well known for his Bach revival movement, in which he tried to promote all of the Bach pieces, which at the time weren't that popular, weren't played that much. And the first performance, we can see it happens in 1840. So 100 years later is when Walt Disney does his animated film Fantasia, and it presents an orchestral version of it with Stokowski. And that version in particular is what made the piece even more popular to the white masses. And many of you probably from that moment onward heard it in some form of media. Nowadays, of course, YouTube allows us to also hear the original organ version. So many of you also might have heard the piece through YouTube videos where you can see the piece being performed. Right. Now, when you watch the Walt Disney animated film, you will see like it's of course edited, and it also has like this storm, and it's depicting like program music. But of course, the original piece in itself, didn't have any program, but it's relatively abstract music, right? Absolute abstract music. A lot can be said more about, the dates and the background. So if you would like to read this, you could clearly, go to the Wikipedia article and read more about it. But what we'll focus a little bit more is on a couple of technical details. The first interesting one is that the key of the piece, if you look at it on the cover, it's a Toccata con Fugue, right? So that's not something that Bach would usually write, that term. It's toccata with a fugue. And then it says that it's in the key of D sharp, but you have X and then D sharp. Clearly, someone wrote here, I believe that's like D minor. So D minor is usually like the key that we're associated with. Now, why is this important? Because if you look at the first page, you'll notice that there's no key signature, right? I can show you like the manuscript, I had it here. There's no key signature. So if we go to even the edition that I'm using here, the Urtext, they still don't use it. Was that common or uncommon at the time? Well, back then, there were two ways of thinking of modes. You could have the old theory of modes with Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, in which case key signatures were avoided. And then you had the tonal theory, in which key signatures worked by a circle of fifths. In this case, in spite of not having the B flat, the B flat is almost always present. And the way that tonality is working here is not like D Dorian, which would be like the key that we see there, but really as D minor. So there's a little bit of discussion on that, and that's why they say that, this piece sometimes is mentioned also as the Dorian toccata, although clearly it's not Dorian, and that there are other pieces that kind of could receive better that term. And then there are different ways of transcribing this, because as you can see, the manuscript writes it this way, but the first editions were writing the rests a little bit differently with the fermata signs, and also included notations like this that weren't characteristic. So once we can see this, there isn't much about the fugue. I mean, the article is quite simplistic and it doesn't provide us a very big explanation of the fugue. We'll definitely focus more on that. And then the coda, again, it's like a very short description. And basically what it features mostly is this plagal cadence, which is the cadence that ends the piece. As for the performance, there are different durations. I mean, the piece can last between 8 and 10 minutes. Sometimes it can last more if you're playing at a slower tempo. And the reception, well, the piece is really interesting because sometimes it's described as very suitable for the organ. Others describe it as completely unorganistic. So we'll be looking into that, and clearly, well, like the most important detail, I mean, you can see that the article is quite long, is the fact of the authorship. So there are different arrangements. Here is the film that I was talking about. And here you can see authenticity and reconstructions. So in this part of the article, they talk about different musicologists that were, well, trying to explain the different reasons for which they might not believe that this was written by Bach, although it might have been also like too modern for a young Bach and also too simplistic for a middle-aged Bach. That's what it's pointing out. So if the simplicity factor would be explained, then probably the piece was written for violin originally, and that kind of explains why we have a lot of these monophonic parts, and then Bach just added a little bit of the polyphony. And if it was later on transcribed for organ, maybe not even by Bach, but by someone else, then that would account a little bit for its modernicity. So technically speaking, one of the theories is that Bach wrote the piece for violin, and then someone has written that arrangement for organ. However, well, there are many more theories about it, like the gallant elements that can be seen, and even I would argue that the romantic elements. So it's really fabulous that such a unknown piece somehow became extremely popular and made it into music history. And I believe that all of us can appreciate the beauty and the complexity of the piece. And as we'll be analyzing it today, we'll clearly realize that whoever wrote the piece was a clear musical genius and had a really great understanding of music theory, of structure, of form, on how to deal with tension, on musical direction, and much more. So this is kind of like the main thing. And for me, I mean, it's not so important as whether the piece was written by Bach or not. I would be referring in this video as a piece by Bach, so I'll be always saying Bach. But clearly, music research right now, well, it's debating this problem, and the debate continues, as you can see in the 21st century. For me, clearly, this doesn't feel like a problem, and I would definitely consider like this piece a masterpiece, regardless of who wrote it. Now, here we can see an example of this transposition. As you can see, in a violin, it would look probably in a different key, in the key of A. And quadruple stops like this also are quite common, and they might work in the violin music. So unfortunately, we don't have like the violin version of that. Some people have done it and transcribed it, but that's what you have. So this is basically what we have in the Wikipedia article. I would like to, before we begin, ask ChatGPT a couple of questions. So the first question that we could ask him is, why is Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor so popular? Although we probably can attribute it to Mendelssohn and Disney, but it would really be interesting to know what it says. Here, ChatGPT is pointing to quite clear points. So he is saying that there is a dramatic and emotional impact that you can hear clearly with the opening, right in those chords. Also, its association that it has with horror music and popular culture. So you can see it with the Fantasia film. Also, there were other movies, as you can see, prior to that. The virtuosity, of course, usually this piece is used as a showcase. We'll see that there are many passages where people tend to really speed up and like make a good display of their performance skills. And there is also this timeless appeal for Bach's music. So Bach's music in general has acquired in our culture this timeless quality, and which most of his compositions are very well studied and considered masterpieces. Also, another point that you can see here is the organ. Of course, it provides like this massive feel, but well, there are many other pieces for organ that aren't that popular. Same like with Bach's music, not all of it is so popular. Simplicity, well, I would argue that clearly the toccata, it's quite simplistic in terms of melodic writing, so you only have one line. You don't, in terms of polyphony, we don't have that much going on. But at the same time, in terms of structure, it's extremely complex, and it's quite hard really to pin down exactly what's going on in certain points. And of course, the crossover appeal is there, right? Now, we could ask actually ChatGPT to analyze the piece for us. So I could say, make a bar per bar analysis of the toccata. We'll say, please. And he might actually give us a little bit this bar per bar. So we can see that according to him, well, there is this opening in D minor, the first two bars. There are these ascending scales, which is really what happens with arpeggios. You have the health notes, that's this part. Then there is a development of the motive in which Bach is playing with that type of motive. Then there's a little climax, as you can see. And probably that has the arpeggios, which will eventually lead to the final cadence. Right. Now, this structure isn't so wrong. So basically, we could be technically like defining the structure of the toccata by different segments and say like we have first one part, then another one, and just describing what they are. But clearly it lacks a little bit the motivic relationship. So we would really need to explain better how the different sections are connected and when they are leading to. So here you have like the cadential resolution and the ending. And of course, the main thing that a lot of people say is that it's in free form, it's improvisatory, right? And that's quite common in toccatas. So you would have these different segments, one after another. So that's what it says about the toccata. Let's ask him what he thinks or the fugue is. So, and then we'll begin our analysis based on that. But I believe that, well, what I'm receiving right here in front of me, it's quite accurate. I mean, let's kind of compare. So it says the toccata begins with a striking descending 3-note motive. Well, it's not clearly 3-note motive. If we look into the score, we can clearly see that it's much more than 3. To be precise, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes, right? And the 3-note maybe, or maybe the 3-note motive is like that mordent. Although, again, now when we'll analyze it, it doesn't have to be 3 because Bach is writing a mordent which can be performed like this, or you have different ways of interpreting. So that would be incorrect. Then the motive is simple, that's correct. It's followed by the scale D minor, also is right. It introduces tension. I would argue that yes, that's true. Then Bach is expanding that with scales, and with that he goes from A D minor to A major. Yeah, that's correct. And the organist, presents fast runs in the right hand while the left hand has sustained chords. That's clearly incorrect. So if we look into this, both hands are presenting the runs, right? So as we can see, ChatGPT kind of has a rough understanding of basically, some things that are happening, but then he incurs into a clear outline, clear mistakes and lies like this, and the description maybe of that 3-note motive, which not necessarily has to be 3. So we could continue doing that, but I don't see really much sense because there will be a lot of fallacies and lies in the analysis that clearly are not happening. And as you can see, in the analysis of the fugue, he is also identifying where the structure is happening, the main subject, the answer, and then the subject again reappears. These developments, because usually what a fugue is, you have expositions or developments and transitions. And then he's highlighting some of these, right? But well, mostly I wouldn't trust this analysis much, because clearly it can fall into multiple times, inventions or assumptions, because clearly ChatGPT doesn't analyze the score itself, but what it mostly relies is on other written analyses that were published somewhere. And if not much information has happened to be on a certain topic, it starts to make it up based on other sources. So that's basically what we have from this introduction. Right, so without further ado, now we are officially beginning the analysis, and we'll start with the toccata. And the first thing that we would like to do is to go, I guess, through the different parts that it has. Right, so I'll begin playing, and then whenever I am gonna be pointing a line, we have a sectional break. The first thing, of course, is to highlight where the main section ends, which is here. It's 30 measures. That's where the toccata completes. So we'll start. Right, and as I said, there are different ways you can play this. So my preferred way is to combine and alter different types of length of mordents. Here I did 3 notes, 5 and 3, but basically you could be doing it your own way, because the notation allows us to have that flexibility. And that's where the motive ends. Now clearly that's not a fully large statement, but it's distinct from this. Right, and in a way, if you would like to integrate these two, I think it's perfectly fine to think of all of that as the first idea. Then what follows is this. Right, and we have that long note. By the way, the fermat is on that note, so a lot of the times people shorten that note, but the correct thing would be to do this. Hold it and have the rest. Right, so that would be basically this ascending part, and after that we can see that we have a descending set of notes. So as the main cadence happens to be here, I would argue that all of this second part section happens to be up to there, right? Like what was happening here, we had 3 statements and then the cadence. Now we have 1, 2, 3 statements and then we have the cadence. So we'll be getting into that. Now let's continue. Now we have probably one of the most iconic sections that I already played a little bit. There's staccato. And it ends actually on the dominant. It doesn't have the D. Then you have this. And that leads us to another dominant chord that we have there, sustained. Clearly it continues. Right, so from this point onward, we could argue that something new happens. Maybe there are 2 ways of thinking about it, but the diminished chord starts here, and that's kind of like the final part. And here I would argue that, well, we have this segment that's quite unique, and then we have this other section that's based on this Andalusian half cadence, which is movement from dominant, from the tonic to the dominant. Then we have this these descending arpeggios, first descending and then ascending, but they're diminished. And they lead us to the final cadence, which has the pedal melody. Right. And that's the ending. So there are two ways we could conceptualize this. You could consider that all of this kind of leads there. But if we look into this, it says clearly prestissimo here. I'm not assuming that this part is played prestissimo or the fugue is prestissimo, but probably the tempo is missing there, because also we have the prestissimo there and we had it here at the beginning, but the adagio happened to be only written once and there are no other marks. And most likely when we have these slower chords, they're meant to be in the adagio tempo. One way to defend this posture is to look into the ending, and in the ending clearly we can see that there are these short passages where adagio is said and then we have vivace, so adagissimo, presto. Every time that we have like the melody and the bass or the chords, it's clearly meant to be played slowly. So this is the overall segmentation. Let's now try to make sense of it from a more analytical point of view. So I would say that this is like the exposition or the first statement of three motives. So you have here the statement of three motifs that basically build the entire toccata. What are these motifs? Well, the motifs that we're seeing are, we'll put different colors. So we'll have I wanted to pick the yellow color there. So we have the mordent, which consists of a pedal point that's alternated with another note. So the most prominent expansion of that motif is clearly when you have this. Right, so that would be kind of like the development of that yellow motif, which goes in that way, and also it becomes the fugue theme, right? We have, so that type of alternation is happening there. And the other motif is the descending scale, right? So we can highlight it here with red. The scale is basically, most of what we can see is based around scales. We'll be now looking into maybe this passage. There's a great development of the scales motif. And also the scales are present here. So in spite of having that alternation between the pedal point and the scales, well, both elements are present. And also you can see how that opening that we were seeing there really becomes the theme of the fugue, right? Which is quite unique, and at the time themes of fugues and preludes tend to have a relationship, but we don't see, for instance, that type of relationship in all of the preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavier, which is kind of a great example of preludes and fugues by Bach. And the final, well, this is done 3 times, so we can see how that motif is restated here. And the next addition probably is like the new part, and it's the arpeggios. Right? We didn't see arpeggios so far, so all we had the scales or alternation between a note and a different note. So what we can see now is this arpeggio is a very dissonant chord. We'll talk about it, but it's clearly like a new motif, and the arpeggios, for instance, become then one of the core elements of this. You could split them actually into 2 forms. So you have the melodic form, which is when you have one note after another, or you could see them also as the harmonic form, which is happening there. I might actually give it a slightly different color. Maybe let's give it this light blue, And that's kind of what we see in these parts, right? Where the block chords happen to be. So basically from this opening exposition, the materials of the entire Toccata and Fugue are presented, right? As I said, the first motif is the alternation between pedal point and something. The second motif is scale, and the third is arpeggio, right? And with these three ingredients, Bach is able to basically improvise or compose, in this case, this toccata. Now, what is happening in terms of the different harmonic elements? Because we don't have really harmony. I mean, we only have one melodic line. We have this descending profile here, clearly, so that's worth pointing out. But it's not fully descending, so towards the end, we have this little rising, ascending motif. So I'd like to really highlight this better. So the motif is not fully descending. And that type of twisted motion is really what characterizes the further developments of the motif. So you can see this. It's almost like the same concept we were seeing in the previous video, where I was arguing about the arpeggio, that is really important for the melodies. Here, that arpeggio is clearly like highlighted with the three notes, the three main notes. We have A. I'll be using green as I was doing it last time. So we have A, F, and D, right? And these three notes are kind of like the main structural notes that are always present. And there are different ways to present them. So you can do it with steps, like in the first case. Or you can do it by skips. Right? And these two forms really create what we can already ascertain or describe as ABA form. So you clearly have the A motif, or phrase A. We can say it's phrase A. We have a phrase B, which is a variation. And then we go back to the first original phrase A. Right here, phrase A again. And that kind of creates this ABA ternary form, which gives a lot of logic. I mean, it's needless to say that all of this is just going downwards. So it's a very big descent that goes from the dominant, in this case, to the tonic. That's happening 3 times, but most prominently, I mean, the tonic that's reached is this low D, right? Quite modernistic in terms of nature, because at the same time, very minimalistic. We only have a melody that's a dominant, and every time that dominant is going to tonic, so we have this 5-1, constant 5-1, which is like a perfect cadence. And eventually that leads us to like the bottom depth, which happens to be this low D in the pedal, right? It's kind of hard to imagine how this arpeggio or this part would sound on the violin. At the beginning is quite clear, but that part is much more hard to achieve. And I think that it's quite impressive when we reach that D, the depth and the power that it has. Right. And the final thing that I would like to mention or draw your attention to, it's the importance of these silences. So there are 2 types of silences here. You have silences that are dramatic. So you have these dramatic punctuations. And there are other silences that are more like a little breath mark, or in a way articulation, right? So we're articulating with the silence at hand the 2 motifs. So this is more articulatory, this is more dramatic silence. But pauses are really present here, and throughout the entire toccata, you can find this very unusual presence of silence. I mean, we have here this pause, another pause. Everything is super articulated. You have again here silences everywhere, and they're present all over the place. So that's not something that you would see much in Bach. Bach's music tends to have a much more constant flow Although still in the toccatas, you might be seeing some of this writing, but even within the style of Bach, it's quite unusual and quite uncommon to see such a big frequency of silences, right? And these silences are what I believe contributes to the majestic sonority of the toccata and makes it so unique. So let's continue. The next thing that we have here is this blue thing. So clearly it's one of the most dissonant chords written at the time. We have this D, on top of which C sharp plays. That's already a dissonance. We have E, that's another dissonance. Already that's a cluster. And progressively the chord emerges. So what is the chord that we can see? It's a diminished seventh chord, so it's the 7th degree, diminished seventh. And that chord is supposed to resolve into the tonic. The only thing that makes this more unique is that it resolves to what we call the Picardy third, which is the major. That would be like the normal resolution to D minor. And this Picardy third is particularly enhanced by the ascending motive that is produced by what we call the suspension, right? So is this 4 suspended? The 4 is supposed to go to 3, and that's exactly what it does. 4 goes to 3. So we achieve this sort of suspended chord that goes to major, but at the same time Bach is introducing that type of ornament. It's an elision, right? Instead of going directly to F, we have this little E. And it kind of resembles the motive we had at the beginning. Which again kind of reminds me somehow of the Pink Panther theme with the same type of chromaticism. The interesting thing is that the ending, which is the most common place for introducing these Picardy thirds, because most minor pieces usually ended on a major mode, doesn't have that. So we have a clear D minor ending, right? And this is quite uncommon and very strong for the time. So the D minor ending with no Picardy third. And the other striking thing is that it's not a perfect cadence, it's a 4-1, which is a plagal cadence, right? So it might have been much more common to end the piece exactly where we left it. So end the piece with that type of Picardy third, right? With the 4-3 and the diminished chord. But basically, this statement contains everything that the toccata was going to be. So that's also quite sophisticated and modern. At the time, toccatas tended to be much more freer in form and improvisatory. In this case, the main ingredients have been set: 5-1, 5-1, chords, the 3 motives, and everything that's going to follow is just going to be development of that. So we can call this next section first development. That's how I would like to refer to it. The first development, which will last until that perfect cadence that we see there on the D minor, is basically the inversion of the motive. So this is what I would like to call inverted exposition. If the main exposition was based around the descending scale, or the descending path from dominant to 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. The next exposition or the development is an ascending one. You can see it's going upwards, clearly moving upwards, and it's going from the main notes in the reverse order. So we have the D, the F, and the A, right? So it's this arpeggio. And harmonically is just the opposite. So if at the beginning we were having what we can clearly describe as a perfect authentic cadence, here we would have a half cadence. So when we have this opening, the dramatic punctuation, the silences really what they do is they try to produce a sense of resolution, right? Whereas in the half cadence, well, what these silences do is they enhance tension, right? And they are increasing the amount of accumulated tension. And then as we move forward, you can see in this case that, well, all that it happens is just the opposite. So here we're going an octave below, right? Bach was doing an octave below, lower. This is an octave higher. So that's the inverted. Here we had three statements. So we had three statements of this motive, complex motive. It had two parts. Now we are having only two statements, right? So that kind of is a very common duality between moving between 2 and 3. And these two statements are combining at the same time the 3 and 2 rhythms. So we have 3 against 2, right? And you might be wondering what's the whole point of the meaning of 3 and 2. In Bach's music, numbers 3 and 2 acquire a special symbolism because 3 is associated in Christianity with the Trinity of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, whereas the number 2 is associated with the imperfection that happens from Adam and Eve, the first two human beings, right? And that type of symbolism is really present all across the religious pieces by Bach, which constitute almost like half or more of his production, and also we can see them translated into the more secular pieces like this one, right? So it's no wonder that he's like really combining these. And always we can see that even the motive itself is repeated 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and then we have the 1, 2. And the entire thing is basically a statement of 3 notes, right? So I could briefly kind of highlight here where the numbers are. You have here 3, that's again 3. In a larger mode, we can see that the 3 are happening with the big statement. So we have 1 here is the 2, and the A is there, the 3. By the way, actually I could shift this to here because that's where it appears. Right, so that would be really like the overall structure of it. Now, I think I wrote here 1. It was supposed to be 2, and that's supposed to be 3. So after we have this tension on the silence and the next tension, the next thing that we can see is the development of the blue motive, which kind of makes sense because it's the arpeggios. But in this case, the arpeggios are developed in a quite unique way. So what Bach is doing in this descending scale, it's to play with the natural minor scale. Prior to that, we had the harmonic minor. These are 2 different scales. So in the harmonic minor, we have the C sharp, and the natural one is the C natural. So we first heard all of these C sharps, and now we're hearing natural. And this is where it starts. It's descending, creates this chord. It's basically a descending sequence. Now, why is this quite uncommon? Because this descending sequence is performed in a very direct way, and basically it's doing parallel fifths. If you are conceptualizing the harmony there, it's E diminished, D minor, C major, all parallel fifths, chords, and root positions, right? So it's not very common to have a descending sequence of root positions. I would say it's very very uncommon and orthodox, and you wouldn't even find that in composers like Beethoven, who really played with parallel chords. What it's here clearly showing us that, I mean, this is very unusual for Bach, but you have it like in certain parts like that, and it is D minor prelude, but it's diminished chords. right? So the diminished chords kind of like have this logic. But in this case, we're alternating diatonic chords, and that's kind of unique. You have the D minor, the second degree diminished that goes to the tonic minor. Then you have the 7th degree major that goes to the 6th degree major. Right, so these are like the chords. Then we have the 5th minor, very unusual. That's kind of a modal mode, modal sonority. Then you have the 4th, the 3rd degree major, also not common in the D minor scale. You wouldn't harmonize with that usually. That goes to the tonic, and then eventually here is where the harmonic minor scale appears again with a diminished chord. So that's the harmonic minor, right? And that harmonic minor is clearly like the chord that eventually becomes this equivalent of that. So we have this diminished over tonic, right? This is actually the dissonance as was happening here is not from the diminished chord itself, but it's of the fact that it's over tonic, right? So that's creating a very unique sonority. And here, if you're going to see what happens, here is a condensation of the diminished 7th over tonic. Right, so it's very related to that passage. And that descending sequence of root chords, it's very striking. I mean, there is some counterpoint, so it's not at all that bad. I mean, the counterpoint happens from the fact that these are ascending arpeggios, right, that in a way overlap. Right, and that kind of makes the whole sequence smoother, because if we are only to analyze it like this, that's a straightforward mistake in terms of proportion and harmony. But the fact that Bach is playing with these suspensions, you can see that it's the diminished chord, that then you have the E that's suspended that goes to D. Unfortunately, a lot of the times when I hear this played, it's played like this. So people just are highlighting the ugly part, so to speak, which is the parallel motion, but forget about the beautiful inner motion. So let's kind of highlight that. I think it's quite interesting and unique. So if I were to do this, let's maybe pick orange. So we have the E. Orange is not seen very well. Let's maybe go to yellow. There we go. The E is the suspension, then you have the D. And you could technically tie them and so forth, basically explain how this is a new chord. So we're moving from 2 in root position to D minor, and a D minor ninth, right? So it's a D minor ninth in which you have the last inversion. So it's like this D minor, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th inversion is with the letter D, right? That suspension of the E then resolves to D. And in a way, it avoids the parallel fifths, right? So the parallel fifths problem was the fact that E minor would go to D minor, but the moment we go this, we're not having the parallel fifths, we're having a fourth. And then that resolves to the fifths. So that's the true sequence that's happening there, right? And I would really like to highlight those suspensions. So suspensions that we're seeing. Suspension of 9 to octave. That's what we happen to have there. So it's the ninth that goes to octave. Like that, right? And you might be wondering, what is the whole overall logic of that, or what is the direction? Well, clearly it's descending, so that's kind of the opposite of what we were seeing there. If we look at the first exposition, and it was descending and then ascending. First we go down. That's down and then up. But in the first development, it's first up. up, 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 and then it's descending. Right, so basically that's a quite unique development, because it's just the opposite in terms of movements, in terms of motifs, and there's a little extension. So I wouldn't argue that this is like, it's an extension that sounds like a little recitativo, right? This little recitativo, I mean, it does have some value, so we shouldn't just carelessly skip it through, but the main ingredients, apart from the direction that we can see, is the fact that we are seeing the motifs that were already presented. So what are they? We have the scale, which is the red part, and we have the arpeggio, which is the blue. So these two materials are interlocked in this type of motif, and they eventually lead us to the D minor tonic. So again, that is not so common in Bach's piece. You wouldn't find like chords, then a recitativo, and then this chord, and then silence. It's very dramatic, very romantic. Actually, a lot of romantic composers, inspired by this piece, experimented with these dramatic textures. One of them, for instance, Liszt. Liszt really has these types of recitativos, and he, if I'm not mistaken, made one of his arrangements consists of on a pianistic version of this, in which he kind of highlights these different parts. All right, so I would like actually to introduce here my PhD dissertation, because as you know, I always say in the videos that I'm a doctor of musicology, but many of you might be wondering like, what is my dissertation about? Because in my dissertation, one of the things that I do is I analyze this from the perspective of my topic. So my dissertation, which was finished in the year 2020, that's like 4 years ago, it was titled Analysis of Silences in Music, right? And one of the things that I do, and I encourage you to read it, if you would like me to do a separate video on the topic of silences, I'm really happy to do that. So please leave that in the comments, because that will give me some idea of, well, how much interest is on the topic. But well, the dissertation is available online. You can just Google my name and the dissertation name, and you'll be able to download the PDF. And one of the things that I do is I analyze Bach's Toccata and Fugue. So let me see if I could kind of find that. Toccata, right? Silences, suspenseful silences in Toccata. And here you can basically see the things that I was mentioning. So you have these brief silences that kind of create articulation, non-legato separation. You have suspenseful silences, which happen to be these longer ones. So the brief one is this, brief silence. Now suspenseful long silence separates the motifs or phrases. Articulation and longer silence, right? And then there are other ones that have like even cadential silence or structural impact. If you look at this, we have the cadence, and that's kind of like a very big structural impact. Then we have this first development, and again, like silences are appearing, and what you see is this dominant increasing tension. Right, and that's kind of where the dominant is happening to be. And well, that's basically my analysis of that. So I actually have a little description of that, which says the degree of the suspenseful passage can be increased by performer's modification of the lengths of the silences, which are freely marked by the composer with recurrent fermata signs. So you have these fermata signs that allow you to expand. Some of them don't have, but well, that's for the performer to decide. As far as I know, none of the performances that I've heard really abide by the strict lengths of the silences that are notated in this course. So silences provide like this speech-like quality. That's actually quite true. And it's probably some of the things that really make this piece so appealing, is that it's like talking to us. It's like presenting a little conversation, of musical conversation. And their presence is particularly unusual in the oeuvre of Johann Sebastian Bach. I was actually discussing that, and that's probably also an argument why probably this piece might have not been written by Bach, or if it was, then Bach was really improvising freely, and it's clearly a piece of genius. And it points basically towards this fresh improvisatory style, right? And I kind of cite actually a paper where Williams, actually this paper is quite interesting, so if you want to check it, the paper by Williams, I want to give you here the full reference of that. It's Toccata in D minor for organ by Bach from 1831 in early music. In this paper, as far as I recall it, Williams is making an argument that probably this was written for violin, and he provides some extracts of the transcriptions that we were actually seeing in Wikipedia of the Toccata in D minor written by violin in A minor, right, a fifth above, in order to kind of make full usage of the open strings. All right, so without further ado, let's continue and move forward with our analysis. So we saw what we can describe as an exposition and as a first development. The piece actually is very interesting because the exposition lasts only 3 measures. The first development, it's very expansive. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? We have triple the length of this. But what happens next, and I actually now think it more and more, rather than 3 separate sections, it's one big development, and it's basically the second development, in which case we would count, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 19, 20, and 21 measures, right? Which is also quite interesting because basically what we can argue is that the piece is expansive in nature, so we have an exposition of 3 bars. Then you have the first expansion development of 9 bars, which is 3 times more, and then you have the second expansion development of 21 measures, right? And I believe that that could be a very groundbreaking way of looking into it. I mean, clearly that's not even remotely similar to what ChatGPT was saying that this piece is, and it could be pointing to a little bit of this very well thought logic in terms of composition. I mean, the piece is expanding. It's clearly not an improvisation, as much as we might really argue that, well, it's improvising because we have like this free character. If it was improvised, it's an extremely well done improvisation with some of the most groundbreaking structural techniques of composition, right? And usually that doesn't happen by randomness or chance. So in this case, it's very clear how we went from this motif into this larger section. Now, in the second development, I'll be arguing how we get from this part into the next one. So, as we can recall, the opening motif was characterized by the scales, right? And there were actually 2 of them. So we had the ascending scales that go like this. And then we had this we had the second motif, which were these broken parts. So that kind of represents like the phrase A and the phrase B that we were seeing, right? I'd like to highlight them again here. So phrase A was this scale. Phrase B, it's not a scale, it skips, right? And now Bach is doing first scale. We have the scale, 4 statements, and then we have skips. Right? Which are basically organized in 2 phrases. So it's very binary in its form. If you want to see the broader arpeggio, here it's again present, so it gives us very good direction. You have this DFA, it's moving upwards. And then there are these 2 themes. So you have one which is going from the A or it goes from not the A, it would go from the G. Da 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 dun da dun, and then you have it again, and a third time there. So it's right. We could see that it's basically the same concept of doing 3 times descending phrase, right? And I think that, well, needless to say, that that's basically what we had here. 3 statements, each time descending, and they're descending each time 1 octave lower. So the relationship between these, I think, is very apparent. Now, how Bach gets from to, well, it's basically by holding that A and alternating with other notes, right? So that's kind of the expansion. The dominant pedal point that we have here is the expansion of a mordent. And by the way, when we get very close, we hear the actual mordent, like here. Right, we're hearing it precisely there. And then the motifs, we have the ascending ones, which are basically the red scales, but well, all of the right hand could be considered these red motifs, right? We have the phrase A, and then we have the development of phrase B. Good. And in terms of what's happening inside, we can see that this is like binary, we could say, because we have 4 phrases, but we can group them in 2. So we have this binary idea, and it goes against this ternary, right? So again, 2 against 3, it's the same topic that we were seeing here with the 2 against 3, right? So this is the expansion of the opening phrase. Now, as you can recall, in the second and the first development, we were facing these descending arpeggios, right, which have these types of suspensions. But if we stick to the harmony, to the chords, and I could highlight them here, so we have the 1, we have the 7s and the 6, and that goes into the 5, right? So we have this 1, 7, 6, 5. That's exactly the chord progression we face now. Right, and Bach is basically now making a development of the what was initially this arpeggio, which was going upwards. Now it's going downwards, so it's this descending progression, but it's the material of the first development descending chords, right? And there, I think the relationship is quite clear. And this would be the material of the opening statements. Right. Now, clearly this part is very popular because of its catchiness. I mean, it's very rhythmic, and a lot of people tend to speed up when they play this, so they start slower. And technically, it doesn't really require much technique to play it. It sounds twice faster than what you play, because you have the notes that are in the melody and then this offbeat note, which creates really what we could say the fastest tempo that we had. It's the 30-second notes, right? And from now onwards, it's not the fastest that we had, because here we had actually 64th notes that I can see, but these were in adagio, right? These were 64th in adagio. Now we're in prestissimo, and we have 30-second notes, which kind of continue now, and this is the rhythmic material that we have afterwards. Now, if I were to play this, I would definitely not try to speed too much, because I think that all of the beauty of the motivic development would get very quickly lost if we just focus on speed. And also, there is a particularly challenging place to play precisely. If you're on one keyboard, it's almost impossible to do it precisely fast. right? It's where the hands cross. This kind of reminds us a lot of what we can see in Bach's prelude in G major that we were analyzing the other day. So we had right, so it's kind of the same type of motif, and really it's also again the motif of the first invention by Bach. So we have the scale and then these skips. Really, those ingredients kind of tells us that probably this piece is by Bach, because we have clearly references to other works by Bach, like the famous cello suite or the Invention, where the motif that we're seeing here, it's clearly developed and it's like one of the main ingredients, right? What I was missing actually here, and I want to point it out, it's the descending motion, right? So it's first ascending and then descending, which is quite unusual because in the first development, it was only up, and the exposition was only down. And here, basically, Bach is doing both directions, first up and then down. So kind of points to some quite great logic to the passage. What happens next is the development of the descending sequence. So it's basically the descending sequence which originated again from the original arpeggio. So that's this development. And let's break it down. So what we have is the descending notes D, C, B flat, A, right? D, C, B flat, A. In a way, they are the opposite of the opening. You can actually see them there better. They are the opposite of the opening because the opening was going from A to D, right? And whenever we had the opposite direction, which was going from D to A, it was done in an ascending manner. So Bach was moving upwards, right? And in this case, it's the only form that was missing. So that also points to a very clear non-random factor. Here we have the movement from 5 to 1, descending, then we go from 1 to 5, ascending. And now Bach does the combination of both at once. What does that mean? Well, that means that we're going from, in this case, 1 to 5, which is this form, but also we're going in the descending direction, right? And in a way, it's like the mixture of these two together in combination with that descending pattern sequence that arrives to this, right? And the way that it's orchestrated, it's clearly like, and this is where the argument for the violin piece stands for, it's monody against polyphony. And this polyphony could be done with double stops or actually triple or quadruple stops. So we have this polyphony against monody. But harmonically, it's what we call Andalusian half scale, right? It's very common in the southern region of Spain, and Andalusian half cadence. So you can see that a lot in flamenco music, right? By the way, a lot of these features that we can see in this toccata connect a lot with that flamenco tradition, because you have this recitativo, right? It's quite flamenco, and then you have that half cadence. So this is the Andalusian or flamenco cadence. And the whole point of it is that it goes from tonic, a minor tonic, I cannot see if that's some small case, to, in this case, it's harmonized as 5, 4, minor 4, and then major 5. If we go to the original half cadence, actually it's slightly different. So it's going to be D minor, C major, B flat, and A. Bach's is B flat, A minor, G minor. So it's, I might correct this. This wasn't actually the tonic. Is the 6th degree. It's the 6th degree. And that's actually a very correct chord progression, because if you look at this, what you're seeing is a series of 6. It's a descending series of 6. That's the proper way to go when you have a descending. So it's a series of 6. When you have a descending progression and you want to do it parallel, that's kind of very direct and it's undesired. But if you have it in 6, it's much more interesting, because you avoid all of the parallel fifths. But again, as we were seeing it here, you have the suspensions, which were making it much more unique, right? So next time you play this passage, please try to do those ninths, because otherwise it'll sound very, very direct and unelegant. But in this case, also the other striking thing is that the movement above, it's not fully descendant, but it also points to another element of counterpoint, which is contrary motion. This is B flat, C A, B flat G, all descending, and they open up. Right? And we have this descent, but then it increases, right? And the fact that the bass is not done twice the same is also quite remarkable. So this variation of the bass line proves us that Bach is quite uniquely considering the bass movement there. Right, the texture, it's clearly arpeggio. So arpeggio was, if I'm not mistaken, the blue color we were seeing. So that's kind of where we are developing it. Let's see, blue color, there we go, arpeggio. All right, I need to remove the red frame it has. There it goes. And that is alternated with the clearer blue color that we were seeing. That's for the block chords. That one. Right, which was also here. Right, block chords. Now, these block chords are developing what we can call as a hoquetus texture, or a hocket. When you're thinking of hockets, it's the technique that was popularized in Ars Nova, that's medieval music, where you would have two singers singing the same line in terms of a hiccup effect. So you'd have one doing an A, and then the other doing the A. And they would be alternating in order to either repeat the same note or create a melody, right? That type of hocket is appreciated with the usage of silences. So it's like the silences or the rest are creating this hocket effect of alternation between bass and chords. And it's also the derivation, or it derives from what we were seeing here. Right, there it was with 30-second notes, here it's with 16ths. Right, and also it's interesting to note that the bass line that I was pointing, this variation of bass line, is not fully unique. So you can connect it in a way to this other bass line that's happening here. Right, so maybe I should highlight these notes there. So it's D, A, B, E, D, A, B, A, right? It's connected to that one. All right, and once you have these two statements, again, we have numbers 1 and 2, so binary form. What we have is now a development of the missing motif, and that's the red one. The red is the scales, and that's what happens here. You have the development of the scales. They're alternated with arpeggios, right? Because you can have a little bit of this blue arpeggio. You can see it there. And also there are some of these thirds, but those kind of derive from that moment. And then we can see once more the blue motif, which is the descending chords. First time they appear in block chords. So that's going to be like the clean blue. And then we have the scales again, right, which are appearing right here with its arpeggio inside. So in a way, it's like a 4 times statement of the descending half cadence. Those are two statements. Now you have the expansion. And third statement. And fourth one. Right, so those are the four ones that we have there. All right, so what is the way to explain or conceptualize this? I would argue that clearly what Bach does here is a variation. So it's a variation on the third repeat. Because if we're listening to it clearly, it sounds like we have first statement. It repeats. And this is the variation of the third repeat. What is unique about it probably is that it actually introduces a melodic scale, right? So we have the B natural. The famous B natural that doesn't appear in the key signature is here. And it kind of presents the melodic scale that was missing to complete, because we had the harmonic, the natural. We haven't seen the Dorian yet, but here is the melodic. And then it clearly moves to this ascending scale. So just in terms of direction, it's a quite ascending phrase that first has a descending statement. Well, we saw that basically in the opening. That's the summary of the opening. And then all of these are descending ones. And the answer to that, and that's the interesting thing, the answer to the third repetition with a variation is the opposite direction. And this, for me, again, is a fantastic argument for why the piece isn't improvised. I mean, you cannot really come up with such a beautiful logic of repetitions and have this opposite direction, first descending, ascending, then ascending, descending, thinking at the same time of all of the compositional and structural implications that we had discussed previously. And here probably we have one of the most striking dominant of the dominant to dominant chord progressions. It's done with what we can technically label as seventh degree, right? Seventh degree dominance, diminished seventh, that goes to the dominant seventh with a inversion, the third inversion. So it sounds like this. Sorry. Right, and it's done by a beautiful contrary motion, right? We had it there, and also we have here this descent that is contrasted. So after this, you would expect, if we are already in the diminished chord, that we end the development of that and have just the final cadence, which is that chord. But the expansion happens now to be in a different style. So this is the expansion of the diminished chord. So what is the equivalent of this? The equivalent of this is that condensation we first had. So first, Bach does this as the first time. Then we have, and now it's right. And the way that it's structured is, again, well, it's the expansion of the famous diminished chord. Let's put it, expansion of diminished chord. The way that it's structured is, again, based on the famous 3 and 2 concepts. So we can see that there is this, all of this will receive probably the blue color because of the arpeggios nature. So we'll just directly highlight that. And what happens afterwards is the block chords. So yeah, that's happening here. And we have a little recitativo, which presents technically the opening motif. If we look in it, we'll now clearly see it, but it's right. It's almost like a restatement, right? But it's developed there. So it's the restatement of the opening to give like a great recapitulation feel, right? So we have this recap. So what is the way that Bach is organizing here this flow of arpeggios? Well, firstly, let's just count the numbers of repeats. So we can use maybe these lines. We have 1, 2, 3. And there we have the fourth. Then it goes down. So these are one group. And you have this, B flat, B flat, B flat, B flat. That's organized again in a binary group of 4. Then we have, now it's slightly lower because first it was on the E, then it's B flat, now it's an octave below, it's E. This is quite common because so far we saw that these repetitions of things an octave lower happened. Then we have an ascent to a new note. This is G. 4 times G. And eventually, well, this just keeps leading. We have B flat, C sharp E. So that's kind of where it goes upwards. Let me put the right color because we're using, in this case, red for up, blue for down. So all of this is a descending scale, descending motion, and then we have the ascent there. So how is it organized? We first have this. That is transposed a tritone. And that then is transposed another tritone. So E, B flat, E. This is very modern looking because you wouldn't expect like such a long prolongations of the diminished chord, right? And this is like transposition a tritone below, and that's another transposition, another tritone, tritone, but at the same time it's an octave lower than the opening. So the opening was here, and the pattern itself is also quite unique. If you look at it, you have the E, there's like one note, and then you have this almost tremolo effect, right? Which is undulating. Right, and that kind of creates a resemblance, I would argue, with this type of alternation between two notes, right? Although it's a much more different harmony. You have just this diminished chord, C sharp diminished. And then Bach is moving. The beautiful thing is kind of how it moves almost like in a canon. You have so something is moving and the other part is staying. That this can be seen really beautifully here. So there is movement, but here it's static, and then this is static, and then here is movement, right? So that kind of points to also a very interesting logic, although it's not done completely thoroughly, but you have that type of alternation between static and movement. And eventually that leads us to the final statement, which is 5, 1, 4, 5, 5, 1, 5, 1. Right, and clearly this is like a restatement of what we had in the first exposition. So in the first exposition we had this type of, and now it's with the neighbor tone, right? So this is like the complete way of doing it. It's the suspension, the 4 that goes to the 3 to 3. And the fourth is here, right? So it's the G goes to F, E, F. Like that. And harmonically, let's just write down the chords. They are quite beautiful, although simple in nature. You have 1, then this is the 4th degree and first inversion, goes to a dominant seventh in root position, like very strong statement. And then Bach really keeps playing with the inversions. So you have, again, the same sort of progression. And then it goes with dominant seventh to tonic. That's what basically happens. It's interesting to notice that, again, like chords appear 3 times. So you have 1, solo, and dominant. And from here, my most interesting remark would be about the interval that's formed there. It's what we call a diminished third. And this diminished third is the same as an augmented sixth, right? So Bach is almost like playing with the augmented sixth harmony. Liszt would have done this, like you would have the G and B flat, or even Mozart, right? And you have, and that resolves into the tonic. So it's a quite romantic looking harmony, that what we can see there. And all of it characterized by, again, contra motion. So if you are looking at the bass, it's whenever it's kind of moving upwards, right? The other line is doing it. So here we have like this statement, it's moved downwards. The bass is moving upwards, right? And whenever the melody is moving upwards, like in this chord progression, the bass is moving downwards, right? That's very cleanly harmonized. And here, contra motion, bass ascends, melody descends, and here melody ascends and bass descends. Again, not random, I believe. I think it's quite well thought. And it's very sweet how these suspensions happen. Suspension there, and again suspension. The first one is also a suspension of 4 to the 3, right? So it's 4 to 3, and then 4 to 3. So that's basically what we have in the toccata, right? The toccata is, in its essence, a statement that's repeated 3 times, a diminished chord, and a resolution. And then this exposition is developed in an expansive manner. First, we have an expansion that's last 9 measures, which we just saw right here, with the same ingredients. And then we have a second development, which is very cool sounding, and it introduces the 32nd notes, and it's the largest expansion, 21 measures, and it's based exactly on the same ingredients that we were seeing in the exposition. Is this random? Is this an improvisation? I hardly doubt so. And one of the things that really put the piece to the test of its quality, it's a test of time. And I think that this is a piece that will never get old, because it has an extremely beautiful array of compositional techniques, and it's very well thought, and with a very strong and bold usage of monody, right? You have this melody, very impactful. No harmony is needed. I mean, you could enhance the harmony, but actually even it loses part of its character, and it sounds worse when you add the chords. So that could also point out to the fact that this could have been this violin piece that eventually got orchestrated. Right, now let's go to the fugue. So we're now starting the second part. Well, there's going to be actually a third part, which is the coda. It's not that big, but the fugue itself, it's one of the weirdest or more unique fugues in Bach's compositions. Of course, the motive, as we can see, it's derived almost directly from the toccata. That's right, the same motive. So for now, of course, as I was using these colors, I need to now pick what colors I'll use for the fugue. So let's use the yellow, which we have used very little previously, to refer to the subject, the main subject. And we can introduce a new color, green, for instance, for the counter subject. So how is a fugue organized, right? The first thing that we need to explain. A fugue is a composition in which usually you have a subject or a melody, a musical phrase that's comprised from different motifs, and that phrase is repeated in different parts. The first and most common way to do this is you have one exposition in which the theme appears in one part, then it appears in another, and then on yet another one. Depending on how many voices or parts your fugue has, you'll have more or fewer statements of these. In this case, this is a fugue that's written in 3 parts. At least that's what we can see for most of it. It's 3 parts that are sounding. Some parts actually are written at 4, so we'll need to discuss if it's 3 or 4. So if it was a 3-part fugue, you would have 3 statements of this subject. And if it was a 4-part fugue, you would have 4. Now, most commonly fugues have what we call the exposition, where the subject is presented in the tonic, and the answer, which is that same subject transposed, it's in the dominant. So you would have this, and you would have that. It's a very common form, and that's what happens in 90% of Baroque fugues, and even classical and romantic ones that are like studied. In this case, that's not happening. So what we can see, it's the first statement, it's in D minor. But the second one is in G minor, not in A. So that actually points to a plagal relationship. And it's what we can call a plagal exposition. Now, plagal is whenever you have 1 and 4. And the only way to kind of justify why Bach does this, it can be seen in the cadence. It's a plagal cadence that ends the piece. So if we were actually to describe this tonality rather than speaking of D Dorian, we could say it's a D plagal toccata. And the fugue is clearly a testament to that. So you have the exposition in D minor, that's the subject. It's sounding in D minor. And then you have the answer in G minor. So what we'll do, firstly, just to kind of see the overview of the structure of the piece, is we'll just go through the score and highlight, as I play, all of the entrances of the subject or its transposed form, right? So for that, we'll be using yellow color, as I said. Let's get ready. So first we begin here. There it starts in the second part. Now we have a transition. Based on a circle of fifths. We're arriving to this moment, so and that's again the subject, and another transition, circle of fifths. Very Vivaldi sounding. It's not like like Bach didn't use much of circle of fifths. Now once we analyze these, we'll get to see them more clearly. But they're clearly more common in the music of Vivaldi. You would see that type of progression more there. Then we continue. We have this. That's kind of a lot like the music of Bach, these imitations. That was another circle of fifths in terms of sequence. And now we have the subject and the bass. Right, I could play it in octaves, but I would be missing a lot of notes since I didn't practice this. So I'll just play it in unison in the notes that are written. And we have. Right, and after that, Bach continues with this type of parallel six. And we arrive to a new tonality, right? For the first time, we move away from the D minor and G minor sonority, and we have finally the F major. Right, very beautifully, it's written there in the bass. And now the first section of monody happens. Very unusual for a fugue. Unless it's a fugue for an instrument like a violin. Right, so all of this doesn't have the subject. We'll get to play it. It's a very beautiful part. And then you have another statement. And it just ends there. And it's back in D minor. So far, we just move from F back to D. And another section follows. With these lovely diminished chords that were developed so much in the first part, in the toccata. So it's a clear standing on the dominant. All of this is like standing on the dominant. And actually, this is an argument for why this piece shouldn't be played that fast. I apologize, but I picked a slightly too fast tempo. You have these 16th notes. Right, and in a way, this is like the climax, because we have the trill, we have the theme is presented here. What is the tonality? So far, this is the newest tonality. We've got C minor. How can we conceptualize C minor? If we are in this plagal logic, the fourth of D minor is G minor, and the fourth of G minor is C minor. So it's like the plagal of the plagal. Right, it's a kind of far off tonality. And the way that Bach actually returns back to home, it's through that concept, because then you have G minor, right? So C minor acts as this plagal of G minor, and G minor eventually leads us, I guess, to D minor. And after this longer sequence, we can see how, well, the theme appears back here in D minor. Right, and it's present there. And we have three statements of it. We have one here, one in the bass, and another one in the middle part. Right, those would be like the main statements where the full theme appears. That's where the fugue ends. And again, very unusual for a fugue to end on the 6th degree, right? It's like an interrupted cadence. But it's not a normal interrupted cadence, because normal interrupted cadences are like this. This one is a minor dominant going to the 6th. Quite unusual. Very modal in terms of sonority, which for the time of Bach either was too old because modality wasn't that common, or it would be too modern looking, like all of the music that we can see in the impressionism that was characterized by these sonorities, right? So far, I mean, just by looking into this, we can see that it doesn't present, if I were to explain what a fugue is, I would never pick like this fugue as an example, because it doesn't really present the features that we would expect a good fugue to be or to have. But at the same time, it's extremely catchy, and it's probably one of the most popular fugues ever written. So we need either to reconsider what is our definition of a fugue, or reconsider whether, I mean, this is a fugue or it's something else that is receiving the name of a fugue, but it's not a fugue. If we were to go with the first expansion of the definition of a fugue, then we would probably need to understand that most of the expositions that happen are only statements of one of the forms of the key, and sometimes they are very limited in expression. And if we were to consider that this is not a fugue and consider that this is maybe a concerto form, then probably like the concerto in A minor by Bach, then probably this would fit more into the type of expansion or presentation that we can see. It clearly has a fugato opening, so it's presenting one part, two parts, three parts, and eventually four parts, right? So that's happening there. We're not going to ignore that fact. But what is happening with the harmony or the further development looks more like a concerto, in which you're having these statements of the theme or a fragment of the theme in different tonalities, followed by sections of solo, right? And these solos are clearly presented here. So I would not argue that this is like the first solo. You have here a solo or a soloist instrument. Then you have here a second solo with arpeggios only, and eventually we have a little bit of a development, but the way that this develops here with this part is like the third solo you have. Right, so technically this could have been even a violin concerto, right, where you would have these soloist parts and then the parts that are like played in tutti and played by everyone, right? But well, let's analyze it as what it says. It says that it's a fugue, so we'll just focus a little bit on trying to make sense of why this is a fugue and what are its ingredients. The first thing that we need to do is to delimit the structure. So the first thing I would argue is this is the exposition, right? The first exposition, and we'll say it's exposition, the main exposition, and the only exposition that we'll have of this sort. Main exposition, it's plagal, as we said previously, in 4 parts, right? It's quite unusual, again, because 4 parts is not what you would expect to have here, when most of the time we don't see these parts. Most of the fugue actually is written in one single part. But technically we can see this part and this moment in the fugue where all 4 voices are playing at once. So once that ends, this is the end of the exposition. And from there we have to talk about transitions or episodes. So the first transition or episode is this one, and it has as its main goal is to modulation to F major. And after we have this, we arrive to the next exposition. So this is exposition 2 in F major. Right? The exposition in F major in this case is a very short one and a very brief one, and it's right there. And after that, you have the second episode. Episode 2, and the whole goal of the episode this time is to modulation back to D minor, right? So we're moving back from F major to D minor. Let's highlight it, and once we go here we can see that we're in the third exposition and D minor. This exposition again is a very short one, and it's followed by another episode whose goal in this case is to modulate. It's this episode. I'm not sure if I was numbering the episodes. We were numbering them. So this is episode 3, modulation to C minor. It goes to C minor. once we arrive to C minor, we have the exposition number 4. Exposition 4 in C minor, the 4th exposition. And this one technically could include the G minor statement, because you could say that first I have it in C, then I have it in G. Right, so we could argue that, well, that G minor is part of the exposition. You have the subject in tonic and then the answer in the dominant, right? If you were not to consider it like that, exposition 4, you could say that that's a 5th exposition, but I think that's going to be too much splitting. Then we have an episode, number 4. So this is like the next type of episode. And from there, we're going to the final exposition. That's exposition number 5. Exposition 5 is the longest one because it has, well, these 3 statements of the tonic. It has a little solo in the middle, but technically it's the last one, right? So you might be now wondering, what is the name of the things that happen between when within an exposition, right? This is the main exposition, the plagal exposition 1. So what are the different things that happen between the yellow statements? So when it's like a short note, in this case, well, that could actually be the final note of the theme. We don't have to say much. It's just the answer and followed by the subject. So this is like the subject, and here we have the answer. But when we have an interlude, like a section like this inside, so I would call this inner episode. Or you could call it interlude, right? So it's a section within the exposition that kind of develops or builds upon materials. So this was what we would have here, and we would have a second inner episode or interlude here after that. So when the episodes are like that, to modulate, they are called so. But when they are within the exposition, so that's what we had in the main exposition, we have also in this 4th exposition, this would be an inner interlude or inner episode or interlude. And if we go to the final exposition, these interludes are really long. So we have the first interlude here, interlude, then we have another one here, which features this famous 3rd solo, and then we have this final one, which is interlude as cadence. And technically the coda of the piece could even begin on this interlude, but if we abide to the score, we'll be defining that the coda starts on the recitativo part. So this is the overall structure. Now our main goal, I guess, is to make sense of, well, how the different parts are written. And this fugue, compared basically to the toccata that we were seeing, seems mostly much more improvised in nature, which is kind of unusual, whereas the toccata was very well thought in terms of all of its techniques. So we start here with the subject. It's D minor scale. I mean, you have 2 motions, so I didn't highlight these, but you have the descending one, and we have then the ascending 4 notes. These 4 notes ascending appeared first time here. You were having them here. 4 notes, and we'll also have them in the coda, right? So this is a very strong motif. You can see it here. Right, so it's being used there at the end. And those are the 4 notes that characterize this. And the subject, clearly, again, as all good themes, abides by the principle of the arpeggio. You have the A, we have the F, and we have the D. Right, and they appear also in structurally important parts. You have A there, you have F here, and the D there. So they're also in a larger form present. Right, what is this counter subject? Well, Counter subject, I think it would be a very big name for this, but technically it's just a series of parallel 6, right? So I would actually give it a color. So I said we'll be using green, so we can highlight what we can see and call this counter subject. So the counter subject, as its goal, it's a theme that appears always whenever we have the subject, the main subject. But in this case, the whole complexity of it is very limited because all it does, it's parallel 6, right? So we have parallel 6 that are moving here. And at the end, it breaks to some thirds, but all of it is just parallel thirds. So the only moment of counterpoint, actual counterpoint that happens here is this opening, right? And in terminology of fugues, this little connector that I'm highlighting here is what we call coda. So I know that this might sound confusing because you might be thinking like coda is the end of a piece. Yes, it is the end of the piece, but at the same time, it's what we call and label these little connectors that happen between the subject and the counter subject. So you would have the subject, down, now up. The coda that helps us modulate, and then we're staying there in G minor. Right? So this is the very unusual fugue. I mean, normally, as I said, you would expect this to be in E minor, but also one of the explanations for why we're seeing this in D instead of A is that in G instead of A is because of the concept of mutation, right? So whenever you're facing a fugue, you can have a mutation, which is the tonic of the new key, the dominant, becomes the tonic. So to speak, if we were to consider that this is A and it goes to D, that's like the tonic and goes to the dominant and goes to the tonic, and the fugues that are tonal, you would have first the tonic going then to the dominant. But that's not the case here because the entire theme is transcribed. So that could be, you could find a fugue where the subject would be in A minor, like in the proper dominant, but it would start on the note D. That's not the case here because the entire subject is in the answer repeated in a different key in G minor, right? So this is very unusual and you won't find that many fugues that do this. By the way, if you do find another plagal fugue like this, I would really love to know about that. So you have the comment section in order to write the fugue that you know that basically does this unusual subject to answer, tonic to subdominant progression. But now, once that is established, the core progression is kind of like following that same energy. So you have the circle of fifths, and you might wonder, where is it? So you have the G that goes to C, right? I'll actually pick another color. Maybe you can just highlight it with circles. You have G going to C, then it's F going to B flat, E going to A, and D. And from that D, all that we have afterwards is just a series of cadences, right? So these are cadences, 5-1, 5-1. But here it's very clear that we have a circle of fifths. So let's highlight it maybe with another color. You can use pink in order to point to this progression. Is it developed as a sequence? Partially, but not fully. So what I mean is you have a clear modal of reference. So this is like the bar that it's a modal. And then this is copied repetition a second below. And then you have again this part as a repetition a second below. But it's partially because if we pay closer attention, the accidentals or are different. You have here E flat. This moves to diminished. And that's completely free. It's not even following that progression. So it's a quite free form sequence. And the logic that we see behind it is that it's using inversions. So if we go closer, this is the 4th degree. Well, I'm looking at it from the key of a D minor, right? But if we were looking from G minor, so that's actually more correct, that's 1 moving to 4. And now you would have 7 moving to 3, which is very common. And from this moment onwards, the 7 becomes the new key D minor, the 6, and the 6 moves to the 2nd, the 5 moves to 1, and so forth. We're basically arriving to the main tonality. The main tonality is established here with the 7s moving to tonic, and then this quite unusual 2, that's quite unusual cadence moving to 1. So the cadence is really like softened in terms of nature. You have diminished when the normal thing would be you have that, right? So this is also something that could be justified partially by the range of the instrument. If this were to be a violin piece, maybe there would be some other aspects that made us pick such a strange chord. But I would argue that, well, this is a very unusual way of dealing with a dissonance. So you would have more this than that type of progression. Right, so what happens next is let's find if the counter subject exists. So we know that the counter subject is this descending parallel motion in 6. It's clearly there, so we have it. And here's where Bach experts would argue that, well, this is clearly not by Bach. Like Bach wouldn't usually do such a counterpoint. Just look at this new part. It's a pedal point that's basically repeating the same note. And knowing of the complexity of Bach's music for organ, you would see more of this in violin pieces where it's easier like to hold a pedal point rather than organ pieces, right? So, but still it works really well. You have right, and I'm just noticing that this is a slightly different melody because the original melody was in parallel 6, but now it's here is the difference. So you have there a third. I'm trying to find the equivalent part of that. Yeah, so it would have need to go to A as far as I understand. And Bach is avoiding that in order to not get the unison. So here there is a change to avoid unison. If we were to do the original form, you would have E, F, G, A, but he does that type of progression with a double repetition of this C sharp D, which is usually discouraged in counterpoint studies. Right, and after that we have yet another circle of fifths, which again is quite unusual to have them so close together in Bach. And in this case, well, the circle of fifths just clearly goes to the dominant, to the tonic, and basically it's like a passage of inner development, a divertimento, that's basically answers this one. Now we have and probably what really makes this so beautiful, it's of course it's used in root position, so there isn't much happening here. It's not modulating like the first one, so this circle of fifths doesn't modulate, no modulation. The previous one did modulate, so no modulation here. And at the same time, as we look forward, you can see that there is a suspension. So there is the A that is suspended on G, ninth to octave. Here is the most dissonant one. And what's unusual is that it's done 4 times. Right? Bach wouldn't usually do that many repetitions. So you have the ninth suspended to 8. Ninth suspended to 8. And again, ninth suspended to 8. Right? So these are like the suspensions in the upper part. The middle part actually is built. It's built around scales. That's the inversion of, right, that type of motive. So you have right, let's highlight it. So I'll be using here the blue. We have the descending scale, and then we have that undulation which is moving up and down, right, which is partially there. But all of the overall movement is descending, right? So all of this is moving downwards. It's going downwards, 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 and with that suspension. Partial, because now, if the first time that was a free form sequence, this is a strict form sequence, which basically strictly does the repetition of the same thing a second below. We have a modal, and doing everything just a second lower. Some dissonances arise here, like this augmented second. You usually would discourage this to composition students, but the augmented second here just provides this beautiful taste. So what happens after that is it's a sequence of half cadences, right? So we're now more like standing on the dominant. If previously we were doing like that resolution back to tonic, right? Back to tonic. Now it's more standing on the dominant on the dissonance. So you have clearly the 1, but it moves to 7th diminished, back to 1, and then again the diminished. So a lot of insistence on the diminished chord, which can be kind of related to the toccata, where we had the famous passage on the diminished chord. And after that, the most complex part of the harmony happens. So you can see here a lot of suspensions, and harmonically really like this is very chromatic, very moving. And it's based on the motif of the theme. So we clearly can see that of the subject. Right, and that type of complexity, it's quite common in Bach, and it's kind of very remarkable how that works in this series of dominant chords that resolve to another dominant chords, and also have these suspensions of the 7th moving downward. So what we can see here right now is how Bach is playing with the concept of the contrary motion. This is moving upwards very beautifully, and at the same time you have these 2 other melodies that are kind of descending, so that's moving downwards, and that one's moving upwards. And all of this leads us to a new chord. So here we're going to the dominant of the dominant that goes directly to the dominant, and from there onwards the harmonic progression is quite straightforward. It's just 1 to 5. But what's beautiful about it, it's how the theme or the thematic material, it's not fully the subject, but it's a little bit based around it, is moving around different parts. So you have it here. It's almost like a dialogue between 2 instruments, right? So it's this little dialogue. between two voices, and at the same time you have the chords. I would actually I wouldn't use the A major, the yellow chord there to describe these chord progressions, but I would use for the motifs, maybe we can use orange so it doesn't get too similar. So those are the motifs, and then harmonically we go to A major both times, right? First with the dominant of the dominant and then there. So that's why I say that all of this is like standing on the dominant. It's an expansion of the dominant. Whereas the first time, the inner episode, was more of cadences on the tonic. Right. So that kind of allows us to see this this inner interlude as one unit. But then we can see how we have this modulation. So it's very unstable. This is tension, instability, stable, it's density, which we have here, and it's also modulations. So it's a little bit of all of that. And what are the modulations that we're seeing? Well, basically it's a circle of fifths, again, once more. So we can see how D goes to G. Then we have A moving to D, right? A to D. So that's like here, A to D. And then we have G to C. This is the part of the circle of fifths. Right. And the way that it's harmonized is really unique, because you have these dominant sevenths that are suspended with a ninth that goes to the eighth. And all of dissonance, right? We have the nines there again. And it creates kind of a very beautiful chord progression where all of these dominants kind of increase the amount of tension. So let's see harmonically. We were here in tonic, dominant, back to tonic, dominant. So the harmonic rhythm clearly speeds up. We're moving now to quarter notes. And now, from this point onward, we have dominant of the dominant, dominant of the fourth degree, which is like the major tonic, going to the fourth. Then you have the dominant, normal dominant going to the major tonic, and the major tonic is the dominant of the fourth again. In this case, you have then the major fourth, which is the dominant of the seventh, and that moves to the seventh, major seventh, which is at the same time, this is minor seventh, which is a very weird chord, so to speak, because it's C minor. You wouldn't expect that in D minor. Well, Mendelssohn does it, by the way, so he has these in the variation Syroyid. He's moving from D minor to C minor. Maybe it was influenced by this, because Mendelssohn really tried to promote a lot Bach's pieces. So here you have this type of C minor. And how do we get from C minor? Well, this C minor is thought from G minor as a 4-5-1. So we have the fourth degree that goes to the dominant 5. And from there, we're going back to 1. So this 4-5-1 eventually actually leads us to the key of G minor. And this statement that we have here, it's not really that much in the key of D minor. So it's clearly in G minor, as was that answer that we were having there before. So you can see that the exposition is oriented as D minor going to G minor. The first way is just straightforward, but then again D minor with an interlude longer one to G minor. So those are the four statements. And that's why we're arriving here to G minor. And hopefully we'll be able to find the counter subject that we were looking for, which was this one, right? Technically, the pedal point is also appearing there, so that could qualify as a second counter subject. So we can put it with that green, and it's this pedal point, right? But again, as a counter subject, it's a very poor in terms of movement, because all it does is just restate a note. Sounds almost like a filler that you would not necessarily need in a in a fugue for a violin, if that's the case for this piece, because you could do it like this. Have the E as a pedal point, and have just those parallel 6, and without the need of having that E as a filler. So that's what we're seeing here, and harmonically it's 5 ones always, so it's a series of perfect cadences. This is probably the most interesting part in terms of counterpoint. It has much more complexity and movement. So you have a lot of this syncopation. The thing that characterizes really this is the suspensions that create all of that movement. But obviously what we can see is a development of that orange motif that's kind of moving here. And it creates these sequences where you have like this type of motif being played twice. It's highlighted properly, so it's gonna be from right, and it's 3 statements this time, right? So it's there the 3 repetitions of that. Well, there's even a 4th one there that I was missing, so it keeps further. And then it's basically based on the ending. So it's an example of motivic fragmentation. You have this motif being repeated now three times. Again, quite remarkable and very advanced. So we have... and eventually we arrive there. And that's the end of the exposition, first exposition. As you can see, it's the largest one in scale and the most complex one. It has all 4 parts, and none of the expositions that will follow will have that. So it's a very unique feature for this. And after having the theme on the pedals, which is also quite organistic because you can have 1 feet fixed and play the melody with the left feet, so that's the pedal melody. After that, we have this part which is a series of 6 that evolves into a series of thirds, parallel series of thirds. So 2 of the most common intervals for harmonizing when we have monody. If this would be just the violin version, maybe we didn't have the 6 and it would be like this. It still works. So you could have it technically written like that. But what we have there is an ascending sequence. It's a very short episode, and actually it's quite interesting because compared to the long inner episode that we were encountering here, this short episode really lacks a little bit that depth. But well, we'll find after that very extensive and long episodes as well. So what's characterizing it? It's the ascending motion to the relative major. And once we arrive to the relative major, which is F major, what follows is a series of perfect cadences. So what do we have? Once we're in F major, it's F, 5, 4, 2, 5, 1, right? That type of progression. And how do we get there? It's through the chromatic scale. This type of chromatic motion. So harmonically, let's analyze it. We're in G minor. We're moving from 4 to major 4, which is dominant of the 7th degree, to the 7th degree. Actually, once you arrive there, you're already in the dominant of F major. So C is the dominant of F major. We can use it to go there. So Bach could have done this. And end of episode, right? So all of the things that happen after that they're just an expansion and an extension. And you have a D minor here, 5-1. So it's this type of D minor 5-1. And then in F major, we have the same thing. Well, we have in F major, we have the 6 to the 7th, right? The 7th is the equivalent of the dominant. And then the 5-1, the famous 5-1 that I was talking about, which also can be seen as 4-1, 7th one. So 7, remember that 7 is the equivalent of the 5 in terms of function, they are dominants. So we have B flat, G minor, sorry, 5, C major, D minor, back to C, and now we arrive to F. All of that to do dominant of the 4th, which is what Bach is doing here, then the 4th, 2nd, and then the extended 5, and 5-1 to 5-1. We have it twice. So this is 1, 2, 5, 1. And that's how we arrive from this ascending sequence. Where is that taken from? Well, that's basically the second phrase of the opening, right? So second phrase of toccata. And based on that, we have this ascending sequence, which moves. With quite parallel motion, because if you look at the main points, you have C, you have there the D, right? There the E. So they're like very, very straightforward. But at the same time, we could kind of see the complexity more harmonically in this type of ascending inverted sequence of fifths. So it's just the 4th, and it keeps moving up. It's this type of sequence where you have a 3rd moving downwards, and you have a 4th moving up. 4th up, 3rd down. It's quite common in all sorts of music. I mean, Beethoven was using that a lot in his slow movement of the Emperor's Concerto. These types of progressions. And it's basically the logic behind what we have here. So we ascend the 4th, and we move down a 3rd, right? And by doing so, we arrive to the new tonality. Once we are here, these are just scales in the new tonality, F major. Right, very, very Baroque in nature, with just a descending gest followed by an ascending motion down there. So this is the episode. It doesn't seem to have much more. And now we arrive to the second exposition, and as we can clearly see, there is our lovely counter subject. Right? It's not fully, it's more parallel, so it's always parallel in this case, since it's inverted counterpoint parallel thirds. If we would have it below, it would be like this. But the thing is that Bach is not changing here to EF. That would be the original one. So in this case, we go back to C. This is a change in order to arrive to this episode. And this episode is the first episode that is a solo. We have the solo melody, monody. Very characteristic of violin fugues or violin pieces that were written at the time. So what is it based around? Well, it has two parts, right? So first part is the descending scales. Descending scales in an ascending sequence, very, very contrapunctal, by the way, because you have a descending motion, but at the same time it's ascending. So it moves us from B flat, C, D, F, D, E, F, at the same time that's going above with D, E, F, C, D, E, F, G, A, and all of that is moving upwards, right? So We have it right there. And that type of ascending motion that's at the same descending creates a great deal of counterpoint. So it actually begins here with this C. So where are we moving? We're moving from C, which was the dominant of F major, to A, which is the third. Technically, it's an arpeggiation. So we're moving from F, C, F, A, down up from the bottom of the dominant here up to the third. All right, so we are seeing this movement that's moving upwards, and that leads us to this static section, which is basically hanging there, hovering in the air as a violin solo, and it's moving between tonic and dominant. Very, very unusual for a fugue, an organ fugue in particular, and very, at the same time, mysterious. And that part kind of reminds us a little bit of the materials that we can see in the toccata and also in the fugue, which consists of this motive. But it's at the same time alternating between a contrary motion. So whenever we can see like this ascending motion in the bass, it's descending in the upper part. And that type of contrast is really interesting. And this static section is repeated here as an echo. By the way, a lot of organists, what they do is they switch register. So they play it like this. You have it here. Then they play higher or with a softer range in another keyboard. And that type of echoing effect, we'll see it appear many times. So let's kind of pick a color for it. Be this pink, the echo. We can see it here, and then it's also down there because you have echo, echo, and then that's repeated a couple more times. This type of echoing is much more common in Bach, so we can basically see this echoing similar to Prelude 1, for instance, for piano, Walter Clavier 1. There you have, then it's repeated. So it's the type of writing we see in Bach. Twice. 1, 2. Right, but well, these are like the three parts that are in this episode. So you have the first one that's consisting of these scales that go upwards. Then we have the statement in F major, right? It's not even modulating, it doesn't go anywhere. And now we have like the modulation or link back to D minor. And this modulation is quite interesting because it's done through a progression that includes ninth chords. So you have a dominant ninth chord of the dominant in F major. That's the G dominant ninth, right? That's the chord in F major, F. And then we have this dominant C7, right? That's the 5 dominant of F. And that moves to this chord, which is, it's not one chord, technically, it's 1 and 2. Here they combine because they blend very nicely. It's the diminished sevenths of D minor. But before that, what we can see is this, you can conceptualize it either as a B flat ninth chord, which is very unusual back then because it's B flat major ninth chord, very modern. And that would be the 6 of D minor. Or you could see that this is an F major, 1 and 4. We're moving between 1 and 4. Now, that explanation also would give us a different understanding of this because it's also 5 and 2. So in a way, they are like connected in a sequence. You can see that here we have this ninth chord that then moves into a single seventh chord. Again, a ninth chord that moves into a single seventh chord. But as the progression is descending, very, very descending, quite mysterious in sonority. And it's hovering in the air. And on the organ is relatively easy to play because you have this three notes that are played with each hand, and they're alternating in a very, very nice pattern. Right, after that, we are arriving to the first time when the counter subject gains a much more prominent role, and it crosses, well, it starts to cross the line of the melody. So the subject here is in D minor, is the same. Although it's even it's shortened, because if you look at it, it's, and then it's incomplete. So we could technically say that this exposition is not fully an exposition because it's a little bit incomplete, but it kind of ties very nicely together with the F major one. So is the equivalent of exposition 2. Exposition 2, it's very similar in nature, and I think that, well, something quite interesting happens here, because from this point onward, like the piece gets a different nature, right? So within the exposition, if we go back to the beginning, we had this structure where we having like one part, then we had this interlude, the exposition continued, another larger interlude, and more complex. I didn't articulate it, but maybe we can kind of give some lines to highlight it. And after that, we go back to the subject. But after this, these expositions are not alternated with these complex parts, but they're alternated with what we can call like these solos, where basically there is just monody, one single part, right? So that kind of points to the fact that from exposition to maybe we're like in the second part of the fugue, in the middle part, but we'll have to actually see it once we analyze all of the sections to kind of make sense of the structure. So here, as I was saying, if we move into this third exposition, we can see our counter subject, which is moving across, right? And it's not exactly the main theme that we had at the beginning, so it's different. So it's a variation of the counter subject. And it actually here provides diversity and variety. But this is clearly not a very common organ writing. It's much more common for probably violin, where you would have these types of thirds against one note. And if you play this on the E string, like a fifth, it becomes quite playable, right? So after that, we have the episode 3. This episode 3 is a slightly different one because it starts with 3 parts. But all it does is just a descending gesture, after which we start with our beloved second solo. So again, a solo part. And in this case, the echoing is again very prominent. So we can see echo, right? So that echoing effect is repeated again. Quite unusual, as I said, for fugues. Very, very unique. And if you find any fugues that actually use that, it would be very interesting. They don't have to be even by Bach, but of any Baroque composer of the time. I don't know that many composers that really wrote fugues with such a clear usage of echoing and monophonic writing. So I don't even recall this being like present in his violin fugues, but maybe it is. So if you can find the examples, please provide them in the comments below, because they would kind of guide a little bit better our understanding of what are the influences or possible sources of this piece. But well, clearly you can see here that the echoing effect, the echo effect continues, and you have all of these double statements. So it's tonic. This is actually dominant of the fourth, moves to the fourth, and from the fourth we're going to the dominant. And this actually is the most extensive instance of standing on the dominant. And when I say standing on the dominant, I mean that there is a pedal point. Here is the A, which is very prominently repeated. Like in Bach's preludes, for instance, we find a lot of these techniques when the second half of the piece is happening, and then that dominant is being extended. And really, harmonically, most of what we're seeing is either a dominant or a tonic. So here we have the dominant ninth, for instance, and that goes to the tonic and second inversion. Second inversion because A is the bass. So it goes to the tonic and second inversion. You could actually play it with an A in the bass and you'll notice how good it sounds. Right, the A there and the bass can be used to enhance it. At the same time, the statement is very repetitive, and it's so because you can see how it's dominant to tonic, and then it's repeated. So we have a repetition of dominant to tonic. And after that, we have these diminished sequences. Back to tonic. Dominant again. So again, that's very, very unique. I haven't seen things like that in the works of Bach, and believe me, I've studied quite a few pieces by him, and this isn't that common. Repetition of the dominant to tonic. So all in all, Bach is just doing here 4 times in a row, 5-1 on with repetitions inside of it. And the only thing that provides kind of some movement or direction is the fact that this is moving forward. It's moving upwards, right? So we can see how we are ascending. We have the B flat first as the highest note. I'll actually switch to another color. So here we have the B flat, then it goes to D, then it's C sharp, and it moves to F. And from F, that's the highest note, we continue the descent down. But after a short period, it moves to A, and that's like the highest note. So the logic behind it, again, it's the common arpeggio that I like to highlight everywhere, but we can see it here more prominently. We have the D, we have the F, and finally it's A, right? So that kind of saves a little bit all of these repetitions. But again, it's very, very recurring. It's almost as if the fugue has stopped, because where's the counterpoint here? Nowhere. Sounds more like a toccata or a fantasia, like Mozart's. That type of writing in Mozart's fantasy in D minor. So this is more like the toccata part. It's definitely not much of a fugue. And eventually this leads to this section. Right, and we arrive to C minor. So how is that happening? Well, after this long and prominent standing on the dominant, which I've highlighted, the harmonic progression, well, here I didn't write the chords, but it's the same. It's you have the diminished seventh that goes into the tonic. So after that, we have this very unique fragmentation where it's 2 notes, right? And also some chords emerge, like this augmented chord. which is from the passing tones really, but there is an F major augmented here that's kind of worth highlighting, augmented fifth. So that leads us to a series of descending figures, after which Bach is doing the final ascending motion, which goes here, right, with these prominent scales. So they're quite unique. We haven't heard them before. You had them a little bit in the opening, right? So it's like the motif of the scales, scale motif inverted. And it's definitely worth pointing out that it's 2 times ascending, dominant, and now descending. But the sequence goes from D to A, that's tonic to dominant. And then from there, we're getting to the dominant. If that was D minor, this is the dominant now of G minor. G minor, dominant 5. And then we arrive to 1 on the next bar. So this is how it's moving. And what is happening in this part? Well, in this part, clearly the scales are descending. So we have these descending scales. And against that, there is this type of ascending motion in the bass. So there is a little bit of counterpoint there. That's quite interesting. And it's moving from 5 to 1, harmonically very straightforward. And this little section here, this would be a 4-1. It's a plagal cadence. And then it goes back to 5. The motifs are a little bit based on the cells that we had in the theme. So motifs from the cells that build the main subject of the fugue. Right, so after this section of primarily monody, with a very, very long solo in this 3rd episode, we arrive to one probably of the most dense sonorities, which is characterized by the trill, right? This trill provides a lot of density and tension. And usually Bach would write these in things like his D minor invention. So we have you would have like a trill in the left hand while the right hand is moving, and it's really like the climax of the piece, a very climactic point. In this case, that's not fully the climax because we still have like the last exposition to go with its solo, and then there is a recitativo that's much more climactic than anything that we've heard so far. So it's an incremental tension, right? And here I would argue that probably a new section appears, because if prior to that, we were like the first part of the fugue consists of this exposition, as like the first part. The second part that we're seeing, it's the one that characterized by these easy solos, right? So it's like just one melody with the echoes, another exposition with the echoes. Now we arrive to the third part, which is like a combination of both the first part with the exposition, but also we have a little bit of these solos, but it's definitely much denser. So in this case, in the third part, Bach is kind of like pointing to much more counterpoint and arrives to a fugue that's kind of closer to what we might see as the fugue. Whereas the second one, it was definitely like almost a long interlude of a soloist with a single instrument. So what are the counter subjects and the subject? Well, clearly the trill could be associated with what we had before as the pedal point, right? So that was the equivalent of the pedal point. But here it's much more dense because before we're just having this. And now it's and the counter subject one, which was the lighter green part, well, is appearing here. You have it in parallel thirds. So I'd like to highlight it here, but it's also modified, so it's not fully the type of counter subject that you would expect to hear. Let me see if I'm able to get it. There it goes. And here we have it there with a slightly different melody. Here the change is mostly happening at the beginning, so it's a different beginning. And in the other case, also we were having a little bit of a change or variation at the beginning. Right, so that would be basically what we can see here in this middle exposition. It consists of the materials that we've seen so far. Obviously, more density is happening because we have the bass melody. And it's a very interesting contrast because all of this was like the last part that we heard, the bass was here in 54 with 4 parts. Like this is the maximum number of parts. 4. And after that, we were just moving to this high range, and there was no bass, not so much bass. The melody was always like hovering above. And from that, we descend back down to the low range, and we have like this much stronger statement. So here again, and after this inner interlude, you can see that Bach is presenting the pedal point. That's the same pedal point, but there is no counter subject. So basically here you have a new counterpoint, completely new figures. So new figures and counterpoint. Right, what is the inner episode doing here? The inner episode is basically moving through another circle of fifths. So we have E flat going, B flat going to E flat, A moving to D, G moving to C, and once we arrive to C, that's the 4th degree, it's just 4, 5, 1, what we are going to see. So this is a very interesting sequence. We're going to highlight it here. And it's based around 4 note motifs, which we saw in the Toccata, and as I've anticipated, we'll see in the Coda. So these are like 4 4-note motifs, and here it's by augmentation. Right, and once that is happening, all we have is type of progression in the key of G minor, right? So from C minor to G minor, how is the modulation happening? Well, it happens through basically the first bar that we have here, because we have progression to C minor. It's 5-1 in C minor. Now that's happening a second below. It's 5-1 in B flat major. Right, we can see it here. So it's 5-1 in B flat major. And after that, it's moving to the 2nd degree of G minor. So G minor, and harmonically it's 1. So here we have minor 1 that's moving to the 2nd degree. And from there we have a very fast harmonic rhythm, 2, 5, 1. And then it's moved to through this minor fifths to 6. That goes to 1. And then we have what we can call here as a diminished chord, diminished 7th chord, that eventually becomes the dominant that we can see there. So that's the harmonic progression there. And all of this is happening while there is a motif, that's this one. This is based clearly on the opening 2nd phrase of the Toccata. And that motif that we've seen already in the fugue is using in a descending manner. So this is that descent that's happening. We can give it actually the orange color. I think we were using it previously as well. So this kind of provides that part, and then the other one is just a counterpoint that goes in parallel 6. So it's parallel 6. It's not adding any new ingredient as such in terms of counterpoint. And after that, what we have is the next statement, which really is like the densest one, because you have the standing on the dominant, the D and the bass. First, it's moving a lot because it's trying to kind of convey this contrary motion. You have the contrary motion, but after that, it moves in parallel. So you have first contrary motion, and after that, we're moving with parallel 6. They're here. And back here to contrary. So it's like this alternation between contrary and back to parallel, contrary, and return there. So these are like the 3 states in which this moves, right? And after that, we have the 4th and last episode that kind of has structural or long implications, which has as its goal to move back to the tonic. So it's modulation back to D minor. And you would expect this to be like the climactic buildup that would happen, but really Bach is developing it in a very unusual way, because here we can see how it's expanding, but then we're still sustaining and we're like hovering on the dominant, feeling, and really where you would expect to be the culmination happens with no chords. So it's monody. It's a very unique progression. So monody with the melody on the pedals. And that's kind of quite unusual again for a fugue. And after that, we have like this last statement, which we'll be seeing. So how is this episode built? First, we have a cadence back to G minor. So similar to the type of movement we were seeing before. It's in this case, 1, 2, 5, 1, moving back to G minor. And from there, the progression is advancing towards C minor. So what we're seeing is dominant of the 4th, and which is equivalent on C minor to 5-1. That's what we see there following, right? So it's this 5-1. So then this G minor becomes G major, and we're in C minor. Now you might be wondering, why do we need to go to C minor if our goal is to move to A? Well, basically this last episode, what it tries to do is make a development. So it's trying to build up tension by adding more modulations, even to keys that are not directly on the path that we need to arrive. Because we were already here in G minor, the easiest thing would be just to do G, A, and go back to D. But Bach is making this development episode to build and increase tension before we arrive to this culmination, which is clearly happening there. So let's see how this is done. You have the C minor. You see a lot of tension. And you would expect there to happen with the D minor, but it's not happening. And eventually it arrives there. So there is already a point here where D minor is arrived. And here we have D minor, and it's a false, it's a perfect cadence. It's a false entry of the theme. we don't have it. And then it seems like we're going to hear it in the bass. We have a second false entry in the bass. Right, the first one is omitted, so we don't really have, we have a little bit of it. A, G, A, F, but it doesn't move further. And here the false entry in the bass. It's like the same type of motive but inversion, by inversion. So it's inverted and you have the dominant in the pedal point as the dominant. All right, so this is the episode that starts here. What are the chromatic movements here? Well, they are moving in a very similar manner to a circle of fifths. You might be wondering, where is it? So it's kind of condensed. It's harder to see, but if I highlight the notes, you might quickly find it. So you have the A moving to D, G moving to C, and F moving to B flat. And that would be preceded by this E flat to B flat. So in terms of harmonization or tonality, this is like 5-1 of D major, right? So we have there a D major key. This is 5-1 of C minor. Right, a second below, and you would expect the next one to be 5-1 of B flat major, and that's exactly what we're getting there. So it's 5-1 of B flat major. The mouse moved. B flat major. And the first progression that we have here, it's almost like a Neapolitan, really, because it's the E flat major chord is the Neapolitan. So we have Neapolitan 5-1, very romantic. And the E flat is really the sonority in which you're hovering here. And that movement of the chromatic scale. So you have suspensions. And the normal thing that you would expect here is that this stays, but it doesn't. So what we have is a chromatic motion. If I were to keep it, it would sound like this. That's more diatonic, but we have the F sharp. Right, very, very dense and complex in terms of sonority. And then there is further imitation, because if you look at the different motives that happen, you have this part, and that's basically the same that is happening there. So it's almost like a little stretto. And in this measure, what we hear is C minor. It's transformed progressively to sonorities that are closer to B flat major. So we could actually see this as a 1-5-1 in B flat. Right? It sounds almost like this 1-5-1. I would write perfect authentic cadence in B flat major, but it doesn't resolve into B flat, but resolves to E flat, which is the Neapolitan. And from there, we're going to B flat. Now, all of this, as I said, these are modulations that in theory were not necessary, but they're all modulations to increase chromaticism, which leads to more instability. And also it becomes much more ambiguous. So we have ambiguity. And all of these ingredients make that the further we look into this, the more we have like this feeling of buildup and increase. So from that moment onward, we have an ascending sequence. If all of this was really descending, that's also very nice. A move in terms of direction. So we have a lot of imitations with one single motif. We can highlight it in orange. It's this motif, ti de do dun, double neighbor tone, ti de do dun, ti de do dun. And it's basically the one that leads us to back home to D minor. So harmonically, what we have is 5-1 in G minor. And then this is a little bit more interesting because you have the dominant of the dominant as a diminished chord, then the dominant and the tonic. So it's this type of progression. After which, all of this being in G minor, we have the statement now in D minor. And in D minor, all the harmony that is left is 1 becomes the 4. It's a diatonic modulation, 1, 5, 1. We're back home. All of this done again with a very good usage of contrary motion. So things are moving around upwards when you have the direction of the other part downwards, and that complementary motion is really interesting. So once you arrive here, it starts to begin to feel as the theme enters here, but it's an entrance on the dominant, right? If the original theme was descending scale, and we first started with the pedal point, now it's starting on the moving note and then the pedal point, and it's moving upwards, whereas the original one was moving downwards, right? And that type of opposite again points to a quite good command and understanding of how the fugue is, the principles of fugue and counterpoint work, right? And all of that is basically achieved after arriving into a very high range. So we have this higher range, and from there we're moving down to a very lower range, right? through this descending scale. And all of the inner parts are still imitating motifs, like these little figures. So you have that motif we already saw before. It's also like based around this formula. And there, harmonically, we only have 5 and 1. So it's very straightforward. 5, 1, and then 4, 5, 1. The 5 is there, extended. All of this is like standing on the dominant. And eventually we arrive here to the 1. Although it's not harmonized, so you have to imagine that is there in the bass. And all of these different ornamentations of the dominant usually are just, if you look closer, you'll have inside of it sequences of 5s and 1s, right? So it's 5, 1, 5, 1, always alternated. So this could be a different chord, that's like the 6th degree. 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. And it's kind of the same as this one. 5, 1, 5, 1. Right, so I would like to highlight this probably as this false exposition that we have, and after it, we arrive to the actual one. And harmonically, it's alternation between dominant and tonic. With a few exceptions, like this is, for instance, a half diminished chord that you see there, or this is like the 4th degree, but for the rest, we are either seeing 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, so forth. Right, so once we arrive here, Exposition 5 is like the most complex in terms of structure, because it features in its own essence, very unique techniques. Like the first one is the climax of it, which is just monody without chords. Then you of course have a statement of it with a pedal point, tonic pedal point, which we haven't heard yet. So this is like the first time we are facing it. And the tonic pedal point really begins from here. So that pedal point is featuring again like the solo texture. This is the third solo, I highlighted it there. That is appearing from that part until here. And then we have also another interesting thing, which is a sequence based on the opening of the subject. So this is like the subject that is reappearing in a circle of fifths. We have D, G, C, F, B flat, E flat, and would continue. So that's the progression, and all of it is based on a false entry of the subject, because you would expect it to already begin there on the D. So these are false entries of the subject. And these false entries build up tension, basically. They kind of provide us the circle of fifths in terms of harmony, but eventually they lead just to a pedal point in the tonic, which is the final one. So, as we saw, the exposition begins first with the statement above, in the higher voice, then we have it down below, and then we finally have it in the middle part, which is also quite balanced. In this case, these are three statements of the subject, and they're all in the tonic. So we don't have any answer. If we were to compare it with the other expositions that we were seeing, so like the first exposition we were seeing, we were having four parts. So we had D minor, G minor, D minor, G minor. The second exposition only had one, and I would really group this with this one in D minor. Second and third go together. Then the fourth one had three entries. So we moved from 4 to 3. And in this case, these entries are 2. So I forgot to write it, 2 in C minor and 1 in G minor and dominant minor. So this is G minor. And eventually we arrive to the last exposition of all, which is exposition 5, and it has 3 entries, as we stated here, of the subject in tonic, non-modulation. But of course with different implications. So in this case, the first one is extended. It's developed with this type of movement. And by the way, that is like the inverted theme. So we can use a separate color for it. Maybe we can use this pink. So we had this theme, that's the inverted one, and it's being reused again here, right? So that's the inverted theme. And after that, we have the culmination, as we saw, and then this interlude. So what is the interlude about? The interlude is presenting a series of perfect cadences. So we have this 2-5-1 in the key of D minor. And then it goes to another 2-5-1 in the key of F major. So you would expect this to be modulating back to F major, and those arpeggios we were seeing in F major, but it doesn't. So this is like a very short modulation that what it does is just go back to the dominant, in this case G minor. It's in its dominant, which is D major. So this is like very similar, very similar to the pedal point we were hearing in the second solo. This was the dominant of the actual tonic, so it's the dominant of D minor, and that is A, right? So that's the dominant. But in this case, we're going to the dominant of G minor, that plagal tonality that we were talking about, and that is D. So in a way, this solo is like a recapitulation or re-exposition of the previous one that we were hearing. First it was in A, and now it's in D. And in order to get there, Bach is doing this 2-5-1 in D minor, 2-5-1 in F major, And now that we're in F major, there are some pivot chords. So we have this 2, and that 2 becomes in G minor 1. So 2 in F major, it's 1 in G minor. And from that moment, you have just a 4 in G minor and 5. This is the dominant. And all of this is like this very extended standing on the dominant. So we have D, 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 pedal point. And the way it's harmonized, it doesn't sound at all like we're in the key of D minor, but rather as we're on G minor and we're having 5, that's going to 1, back 5, 1. And the echoing effect is still retained. So I'll use for this the pink we're using, right? Two times repeated. There is a little variation, of course, but... And harmonically, always 1, 5, 1, 5. The dominants were enhanced, of course, with the ninths. There are some interesting notes, though, here, which are these passing tones. If I were to remove them, it would sound like this. Which also works nicely, but I think here is a great lesson to learn whenever you're dealing with these passages, add these passing notes. Because the passing tones will give you the harmonic interest, they will give you diversity and variety, but at the same time, they will provide you with quite unique combinations. So you would be able to make a variation, like in this case, with that appoggiatura. You're getting first this sort of augmented chord that then goes to minor. So if I were to remove these and I could play this passage, it would sound like this. And you can see it still sounds, it retains the direction, which is this ascending motion, it's moving upwards, and it retains the essence of the harmony, but it sounds quite hollow whereas if I have this, there's a lot of interest with those passing tones. And we arrive there to this false entry. And I think that this is a great example of how you can have a counterpoint of two completely independent parts. You have the melody above, which has its own line, which moves down. And then in the bass, we have just this undulation of the circle of fifths. And these two things magically seem to, well, come together. Well, not without any logic. I mean, it's just G minor, what do we have there, with the 1-5-1, right? So we have G minor, 1-5-1. Then we've got C minor with another 1-5-1. So far, perfect cadences. Then we have F major, so that continues the circle of fifths, with another 1-5-1. And eventually B flat major with its final perfect cadence. And then the bass is basically trying to, well, take us back home to D minor, because so far, I mean, this is the final exposition. We heard D minor on the standing on the dominant. We heard it without anything. And we had this dominant progression on the, well, on the fourth degree. So that's like the plagal nature. You have a G minor. And after that, where is the tonic? So we don't have really a good, strong statement. And the only statement we get is this one, which happens after a very long sequence of modulations: G minor, C minor, F major, B flat. So after all of these, this stable progression becomes, here's this interrupted cadence. So we have B flat. It's 1, 4, 5. You would expect it to go back to 1, but it doesn't. So this is going to G minor, right? And we're moving basically to the 6th degree, right? And after you have this interrupted cadence, we get a perfect cadence, and again on the key that I would think characterizes mostly this fugue, which is the plagal, right? So you have 2, this is G minor, 2, 5, 2, 1 inverted, 5 dominant 7th, and back to tonic 1. And from there on, it's just 1, 5. In the only moment that we're hearing the D minor, it's like from this moment. So we have D minor, with 5 moving to tonic and 5 moving to tonic. Of course, not even in a strong manner, because if you look at it, it goes to really the 4th degree. Right, so it's very delayed. You have this 4th degree there that's very strongly, again, emphasized. And the 4th degree is, again, the plagal feel that you would have. So 4 to 1, that's what clearly is stated there. And what is happening with the motives? Well, the motives, as you can see, they're based on this type of circular motion with a motif that's being repeated twice. We have this orange color, and it's done with parallel 6. So we have this parallel 6. And all of that is happening with a beautiful contrary motion in the bass. So that's descending, whereas in the bass we can see these ascending gestures, right? And then when we have the ascending movement in the right hand, the bass clearly is doing the opposite, right? And here I think we could technically highlight the counter subject, although again, it might present some variations, but it's like the hint of that quaver note, 8th note movement. And after that, we have the cadence. So this is like the final cadence. And what you would expect is to have a perfect cadence, no? But we have a very unique chord progression. It does 5 to 1, and this is inverted. Then it does 4 to 5, and back to 1. And after this, it's this half diminished second, minor 5th, in 6th. A very unique chord progression. And as I said at the beginning of the video, it's much more common to see this, let's say, in Debussy or in sort of impressionistic music, but not so common in Baroque. Or you could see this maybe in Renaissance music. So this goes very nicely from 5 to 1, right, by contrary motion. But then, gloriously, we arrive to this interrupted cadence on the 6th degree, right? And this B flat major is really, really strong. So after that, we arrive eventually to the Coda, which is mostly connected to the toccata. So here I would argue that this is a development of the chord form. We have seen such a similar texture here. Right, so these are like block chords, and we'll be seeing them again at the end. So you have this. Right. So how is the coda organized? Well, the coda is an alternation in this case of motifs that we've seen mostly in the piece. It doesn't introduce anything dramatically new. And at the same time, it's an alternation between speed and slowness. So you can see here that it says recitativo, but then it says adagissimo, very slowly. Then you have presto, and then again adagio, and then vivace. So I would just highlight first like the slow parts, because I think that they kind of will fit very nicely into the category of this chord form. And they also are different structures. So we have the slow movement. That's like the first time it happens. Then you have another one of these. And then we have the final statement of the slow movement. And between each of these, we have 3 different ways of playing fast, right? And they are basically based around the same concept that we were seeing in the beginning, right? So how is the first fast movement based? It's based around 4 notes. So it's the 4-note motif from the second development. We were seeing it very clearly there, I guess. We go back to the second development. It's here. Right? And as I anticipated, well, that's basically what we have here. In what key is this done? It's done in the key of B flat major. Why is that? Well, it's the interrupted cadence that we had. So it's all an extension of B flat major. And it's done through different techniques. So you have firstly, all of this is descending motion overall, and then it's ascending. But inside of it, you can see that's firstly just a set of parallel motions. And then in the second part, it starts actually to deviate. So you have a row of parallel motions and a row of contrary motion. These are like the sections. So let's highlight them with these vertical lines. That will be the series of parallel motion. And now we have the series of contrary motion. And once that is done, we repeat the same. An octave below. That's kind of the same concept that you had in the introduction. So if you remember in the introduction, we had like this phrase A. We could say this was like phrase B. Phrase B is contrary motion. And phrase A again, which is direct motion. In the example of the introduction, we had one single motion, right? Do, 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 do. That's phrase A. Phrase B was twisted. So here we have again one direction. If in the opening was descending, here it's ascending. First phrase is done. Now it's contrary. That's the equivalent of. And then we have the third phrase. And from there, what is basically happening is a development of phrase B. Development of phrase B with which arrives to the lovely diminished 7th chord that we were hearing a lot in the opening and in the introduction. So this is moving upward, and as you can see, it arrives to G minor. So we have here clearly the F sharp, that's the sonority of G minor. And from G minor, we move back to, so there are like 3 diminished chords you can see. This is the diminished chord of G, right? It's presented there. If you want me to highlight it, I'll show you the notes. It's A, C, F sharp, and E flat. That's the diminished chord of G minor, dim 7. Now from G minor, we're moving to D. So this is diminished chord of D minor. And then we're moving to another diminished chord of A, right? And that's basically the chord progression. So we're going from G, a fifth up to D, from D to A. have diminished chord of G, it's diminished chord of D, and diminished chord of A. And that sounds quite modern and advanced, but basically it's the chord progression that happens here. And if you look at this, there's just an extension of that diminished chord. So we're not seeing that much harmonic development. It's just, and if we're in D minor, this would be viewed as 5-1, right? Or 7-1, if you want to see it more precisely. And A would be the dominant of the dominant, this diminished seventh in A. Dominant of the dominant, that eventually resolves to minor. This is very unique, minor dominant. You wouldn't expect that. So that's like the slow part. We're now already commenting this. And the only thing that we're missing is this recitativo in the bass. Where did we hear it? We heard it firstly here, I think. It was very prominent. Right? It was based around the red motive, but now it's mostly based around arpeggio. So it's not based around the red motive, but about the blue motive. Right? And you have there the E. It's a clear modulation to A minor. It sounds to me we're very far away still from D minor. It's like 5-1 on A minor, right? And there we're staying. So after this, the very exclusive chord that you hear is this third major degree. It's C major. That's very modal, and it points to a much more romantic sonority or even modal sonority. You have A minor to C major. Same as the previous cadence was going from A minor to B flat. Very, very uncommon in Baroque tonality. And that actually presents the next part. It's now in C major. So we had the B flat, and we have the C. The logical thing after that is that we arrive to D minor, and that's going to be like the next progression. So the way that Bach is taking us back home is from B flat major, we're getting a step above to C, and now from C through C sharp, we arrive to D, and that's what's going to happen. So what is the motive? That's the second motive, the second recitativo bass, because here we have like the first solo. This is the second one, you know. So this second solo is based on the concept of the alternation of the notes. We were seeing that in the second phrase, if you want to see it, second phrase. We were also seeing this in the subject of the fugue and also in the opening mordent. But mostly I would argue that it's mostly the subject of the fugue. The second phrase is this one. Right, so you could give all of this like that red color to describe the materials. But well, what is happening here? It's quite interesting because you have an ascending sequence based on an imitation of the motif. So I'll be giving it this red. We have it above, and it's answered. Maybe we can give it a slightly different tone so you see the answer in below. And then this is being fragmented. So of course the way it's notated, it's like split between both hands, but really what happens is that you have the red motif ascending more. And then it's again retaken with the same dialogue that we were seeing, which eventually, well, leads to, here we have a slightly different motive. So we'll highlight that motive right now. But what you have is, first part is an ascending sequence. I'd like to highlight with the red how we're moving upwards. So we're moving from G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and inevitably by doing this scale on the dominant, you will be stumbling upon the arpeggio of C major, right? So The important notes in this arpeggio are the opening and the ending one, is G, and the way that it approaches C major in the middle, right? Once you arrive there, this part is much more modulatory, so it's trying to modulate to A minor. And the way it's done so, it's through this 5, 5 to 1. And then you have this type of scale in the key of A minor. So we have 5 to 1. But that A minor is not staying long, because then you go back to C major with 5 to 1, 2 to 1. And it almost feels like that raising final scale, it's a perfect cadence of 5 to 1. So it's like... And once we arrive to this C major, all the following part is just returning back now to D minor through a different set of chord progressions. So the only motive that I said that we're leaving for later is this one, that is characterized by a 6. So that's what's happening basically always afterwards. So we have this. Right, so it's this type of 6 movement. It's there are different ways you can think of it. You could actually maybe see it as more part of that motive, like starts here. And the first time it's, whereas the second one is, it could have continued, but it definitely has more of the scalar motion that we have here. So it's this type of descending scales. And all of the direction is always interesting, because you have descending motion and the motives, but ascending direction in the scales. And that's very common. We've seen that in the toccata as well. Oftentimes when we were having like these ascending arpeggios, but they were facing the descending motion. In this case, it's the inverted. You have the ascending motion faced with these descending scales. That leads us, of course, to the final statement. So the final statement here is first this solo part, which is just C major, moving to dominant, very, very chromatic. So we have 1 in C major moving to 6, major 6, dominant of the 2nd degree, or dominant of D minor. Right, and here we're in C major. And this is now developed with a vivace. And it's interesting that the chord that we arrive to is G minor again. A very bold cadence, and it's timeless. I mean, it's very, very strong. So what is happening here? How is all of this part organized? Well, it's descending. If the previous one had that ascending gesture, here it's always moving downwards. So we have the descending scale. And this descending direction is interestingly harmonized through a series of fifths, or a circle of fifths. I could highlight it here. We have D. So we're moving to D, moving to G minor, C major, moving to F major, B flat, moving to E, and then A, moving to D, and that leads us to G. And so that would be like the outline of the harmony that is happening in the broad terms. And harmonically, that's how we would visualize this. So we would see 5 of 1 in D minor, then that's going to 4th degree to 7th degree. So then the 7th moves to the 3rd, which is here. And that keeps going. So we're now having the 6th degree moving to the 2nd degree, which supposedly it was the 2nd, but now it's harmonized as 7th degree, diminished 7th. And from there on, we're seeing the dominant of the 4th going to the 4th. All of this with a very interesting element, which is that these chords that I'll be highlighting now have inversions. So this is a 7th degree in the last inversion. And this is not the tonic and root position, it's in first inversion. So we are moving between these first and third inversions, which is very common for these types of progressions. It's usually advised, and I advise students to do this type of motion when you are moving from the third inversion to the first inversion. And this is basically what we see. So it's first inversion moving to third inversion, first to third, because that also creates this type of contrary motion. And also it's the same motif that we're seeing. Right, so it's all connected. In this case, by the way, I wrote this as a 4, but to be more precise, this 4 is a major, right? So that actually creates here another little modulation or a feel of C major. So we feel like in C major, we're doing just 5-1. And here, I think that, yeah, it basically stays. So you have this D minor, C major, D minor, and G minor, or the 4th degree. And I really love the way it falls, because it falls on the 9th. And when the 9th resolves, we have the contrary motion, so it's this first inversion. That goes to a diminished chord, diminished 7th chord, and first inversion. It moves to the tonic and first inversion. Suspended, so this is 4-3 suspension in a minor 5. And this is exactly the chord progression 5 what we're seeing here. Right, it was done to go to B flat, so it's kind of like we move back, but arrive to, again, a very unique sonority. It's the 9th suspended. So suspensions here create probably the most beautiful chords, the suspensions. And then you have the 7th, and gloriously we arrive, as we said, to 4-1, which is the plagal cadence. All of this done with a descending scale. That's basically the opening motif. Right. And that scale, if we want to connect it further, appeared here from D, C, B flat, A, and then A, G, F, E, D. So from this moment until the end, we have the descending scale. Right. And that's basically the Toccata and Fugue. It's, again, a masterpiece without any equivalent. I mean, we don't know who wrote this if this is not Bach. I believe that probably it is most likely Bach on the violin because of the features that we've been seeing. But again, I think that really doesn't matter. In my opinion, shouldn't influence you on the perception of this piece. What is clearly the case is that there is no piece like this in terms of Baroque writing. It presents a very unique set of techniques and sonorities. And it became very popular back then in the 20th century, still is popular, and I think it will never run and become old. So these are kind of the main aspects. Let's just summarize what we saw. So we saw that there is the exposition of 3 measures in the toccata that becomes this large introduction. These 3 measures become then in the first development 9. And then after that, we have a larger second development of 21 measures, right? Once that is happening, we end and we have the fugue. The fugue is basically very unique because it has, firstly, not the features of a normal fugue for organ, and you have an exposition of 4 parts, a plagal exposition with D minor to G minor. After that, we have a short episode that leads us to the second part of the fugue that has 2 expositions, one short in F major and another one in D minor. These are the second and third, and both of them are alternated with these beautiful solos with echoes, right? And that part is basically developed then with 2 solos. One is on the tonic, the other is on the dominant. And we arrive to the third part, which is like the combination of these two. You have on the one hand a larger exposition. It's much more chromatic. It builds up, and eventually it leads to the final part, I would say. So maybe here when I say combination, that's not fully the combination. Third part is like the most dense section, and it's characterized by these this larger exposition and then episode. And the final part, which is the fourth part, is the one that you have the combination of everything. So you have a section that's lighter on the pedal point, you have a unique monody, you have again a lot of density. So here we're arriving again to density and complexity. That kind of resembles the third part. Then we go, for instance, to these points, which are clearly like the second part quote or development, because it's doing a paraphrasis of that. Then we arrive to a maximum point of tension and resolve it there into the tonic. And even when that is done, still the plagal feel resides, right? In this last exposition, it's basically 3 statements of the tonic. Once that is done, we arrive to the coda. The coda is made of 3 parts. First part is this first solo that is leading to the first cadence. Technically, there are 2 ways of thinking about it. Either you think that the coda starts on the recitativo, or you could say that the coda actually begins on the interlude here. And if that's the case, then we are having first the chords, then the recitativo, then another section of chords and recitativo, and another section of chords, recitativo, and the final cadence. But if you want to see it the other way around, which also makes sense, it's the recitativo that leads to chords, second one that's based on another motif, and the third one is basically based on the blue motif, right? The blue one was the chords, right? So that's kind of the color that was missing here. And basically, by developing that chordal feel that we were having, we are arriving here to probably the most powerful and strong circle of fifths in the entire piece, which is this circle of fifths that has a descending scale that leads us to a plagal cadence that goes back to the tonic. So that's it. I think that we've kind of covered the basics of the piece. I would really appreciate hearing from you feedback on ideas that you might have about the structure of it. I think that for composition students, this piece is fantastic in terms of techniques, because since there is no other piece by Bach that really does exactly this type of structural development, you could be inspired by it and use it in your own pieces. So I invite my students to do this. And again, if you'd like to study with me, feel free to write a comment below or send me an email, and